I still remember my knuckles going white on the steering wheel as I navigated the rutted gravel trail off a back road in Hocking Hills. The late afternoon light inched across my windshield, staining the sky that peculiar shade of gold you only get in autumn. My SUV groaned every time the wheels hit a deep pothole, but I refused to slow down. I'd come this far, 4 miles of near non-existent road, and I wasn't about to turn back. When I finally pulled to a stop, I killed the engine and just breathed. Beyond my windshield, a dense sweep of forest extended in all directions. Towering oaks, clusters of hemlocks, and the thick hush that only remote woods can provide. My new home, I reminded myself, pressing a hand to my chest where my heart thudded from equal parts nerves and excitement. I opened the door, greeted by a cool gust of air tinged with damp leaves and earth, so different from the city smell I'd left behind. The trunk of my SUV was stuffed with my essentials: canned food, a couple of worn duffel bags, a small generator, a few personal keepsakes. I felt ridiculous seeing them all jumbled there. This was everything I had in the world now. No modern apartment, no curated living room set, no trace of the old life in Cincinnati with my ex-husband. Just battered boxes and a battered heart. But I'd come here for peace, or at least the possibility of it. I locked the SUV. Force of habit, I guess, even though I knew there wasn't a soul around. The cabin was still half a mile deeper into the woods, perched near the rock formations that people called Old Man's Cave. I'd have to haul everything along a narrow footpath that snaked through the forest. My sister, Rory, had raised an eyebrow when I told her about my move. She'd asked, "Are you sure you want to be that isolated?" And I'd said yes without hesitation. Now, looking at the towering trees and the shadows they cast, I felt that question tighten in my gut. But I wasn't turning back. I grabbed the heaviest box first, kitchenware mostly, and started down the trail. The path descended through clusters of tall trees, their roots creating a natural staircase in the earth. The hush around me was almost eerie. In the city, there was always background noise, car engines, voices, music spilling from open windows. Here, I noticed my own breathing, the crunch of leaves underfoot, a distant bird calling, and, occasionally, the sound of branches creaking overhead like the forest was whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. Eventually, the trail broke into a small clearing, and there it was. My off-grid cabin, weathered wood, a tin roof, a sagging porch that practically begged for repairs. I set the box on the porch, panting from exertion. Even though I'd seen pictures of the place when I arranged to buy it, the reality of it felt more, well, real. This was mine now. Mine to fix up, to keep warm, to make into something that felt like home. I noticed the sun dipping lower, painting the clearing in auburn tones. I wasn't going to get all my belongings inside before dark if I didn't pick up the pace, but I stood there anyway, letting the quiet seep into me. A crow croaked from somewhere above, making me jump. I laughed at my own nerves, but the laughter died quickly. The forest returned to silence as if unimpressed. I unlocked the cabin door, stepping into a dim interior that smelled faintly of dust and stale air. My flashlight's beam revealed a single main room, a small wood stove in the corner, and a tiny kitchen area opposite. Off to the side, a cramped bedroom door stood ajar. I flicked the light switch out of habit, forgetting that the cabin wasn't hooked up to anything. A shaky sigh left my lips. I needed to set up the generator, or at least my lantern, if I wanted light. But first, I had to unload. Work before comfort. It took me 3 trips to get everything from the SUV to the porch. By the time I'd dragged the last box, containing my meager groceries and an ancient coffee pot, I was breathing hard. My phone showed no bars. Not that I expected any. The quiet pressed in, more pronounced with each minute of fading daylight. For a second, A flicker of regret crossed my mind. Was I too impulsive in moving here so fast? But then I reminded myself of the alternative. Staying in the city I used to share with my ex, where every corner reminded me of failure. No, this was better, even if the silence felt heavy and unfamiliar. I set up a lantern in the main room and lit it, the flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. After a quick inventory of the cabin, I noticed I at least had a stack of firewood near the wood stove, left by the previous owner or realtor. I took it as a good sign. Once I coaxed a small fire to life, the stove's warmth chased away the autumn chill. A can of soup and a battered pot from my kitchen box made for my first meal in the cabin. As the soup warmed, I glanced out the window. The forest beyond glowed with the last scraps of daylight, the trees merging into a single dark mass. And in that moment, I thought I saw a shape, tall, thin, gliding among the trunks. My heart jolted. I blinked, leaning closer to the glass, but the shape was gone. Probably a deer, I told myself, or a play of light. But goosebumps stood on my arms. That first night I slept poorly, the wood stove crackling softly while I tossed and turned. The cabin's timbers creaked in the breeze, and a branch tapped against the window with maddening irregularity. Once or twice, I thought I heard rustling outside, but I forced myself to stay under the blankets, telling myself it was just animals doing their nighttime business. By dawn, I'd snatched maybe 3 hours of sleep. Despite my exhaustion, morning light through the windows gave me a jolt of optimism. I had a lot of work to do, setting up the generator, hooking up my small solar battery, figuring out the well situation. The next few days passed in a haze of chores. Each time I trudged to the footpath to gather something from my SUV, I found new reasons to appreciate my solitude. The hush of the forest, the crisp air, the feel of the moss underfoot. And yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. At twilight on the fourth day, I heard footsteps crunching outside. I rushed to the door, adrenaline surging, only to open it and find a stranger. A man in his 50s, maybe older, with a close-cropped beard and a worn jacket. He held his hands up as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm Cliff Ryder," he said, voice gruff. "Didn't want to startle you. I live on the ridge west of here." He gestured vaguely over his shoulder. I nodded, heart still hammering. He stuck out a hand, and I shook it warily, introducing myself as Dana Price. Cliff looked around the clearing. "Heard someone moved in here. Not many folks choose a place this remote." He squinted at my cabin. "You plan to stay through winter?" "That's the idea," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He just grunted. "These hills get rough. The fog can roll in thick as soup, and—" He paused, glancing toward the trees. "There's stories about the cliffs and caves. Strange sightings, illusions, what have you. Could be nature playing tricks, but I've seen lights out there that aren't exactly normal. You keep your wits about you, Miss Price." I swallowed hard, recalling that flicker of movement I'd spotted. But I just nodded. He gave me a brief, lopsided smile before turning and trudging back along the trail. I watched him vanish among the oaks, unsettled but oddly grateful for the warning. In the following nights, my sense of unease grew. Twice I found footprints around the cabin in the morning. Bare footprints, too big to be a child's, too inhuman in shape for an ordinary man. The damp soil preserved their outlines, splayed toes that left me shaking. My rational side insisted it might be a trick of the mud, or maybe some local hiker messing around, but fear spiked every time I recalled it. Another time, I woke to a scratching at the door around midnight. By the time I mustered the courage to peek outside with a flashlight, I saw nothing, though fresh gouge marks raked the lower part of the door. I could practically see claw traces in the wood. Part of me wanted to run. Another part refused to let fear uproot my attempt at a new life. I took to carrying a walking stick whenever I ventured far. If an animal or intruder was lurking, I wanted some defense. Yet something in my gut told me it might not be so simple. One afternoon, I decided to hike down to Old Man's Cave. I'd read about the rock formations and recess caves in Hocking Hills, and I was curious to see them up close. The park area was quiet, off-season, so tourists were sparse. The sandstone cliffs rose around me, beautiful and imposing. I walked under a natural rock bridge, the space echoing my footsteps. But as I ventured deeper, a prickling on the back of my neck returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing, not on public land, but on something older, something that watched from behind the mossy rocks. At one point, I nearly ran out of there, heart hammering from a sense that shapes darted at the edge of my vision. By the time I reached the small parking area, my mouth was dry. No wonder local lore talked about guardians or spirits. If there was any place that felt ancient and alive, it was these hollows. That evening, I made a simple dinner, spaghetti on my propane stove, and tried to calm down. Darkness fell early, the woods swallowing the last beams of light by 6. Right as I settled in with a book, a sharp rap at the cabin door startled me so violently, I dropped my fork. It was Cliff again, scowling in the lantern glow. "Heard your SUV at the caves," he said without greeting. "You went alone?" "Yeah," I breathed, still rattled by the suddenness of his appearance. Cliff shook his head. "Be careful, especially near dusk. People vanish sometimes. The terrain's tricky, sure, but some locals figure there's more at work." I swallowed. "What do you mean, more at work?" "They say old guardians roam those cliffs. Ancient watchers. Might be the land's memory, might be something else. If you're new here, they notice. They test you." He eyed me. "I've seen footprints near my place too, years back, when I first built. After a while, I started leaving little offerings. Don't know if it helped or if they just got bored of me, but the trouble stopped." I'd have laughed if I wasn't so spooked, but as it was, I just nodded mutely, a new sort of dread pooling in my stomach. Cliff left with a vague wave. Once again, I locked the door, triple-checking the windows. Sleep came late, and with it, feverish dreams of half-seen figures in stone corridors, silent watchers with elongated limbs. The next morning, with the day bright and cold, I swallowed my pride and decided maybe Cliff had a point. If these hills did have some presence, be it spiritual, supernatural, or just nature's intangible force, perhaps I should show respect. I had a small wooden figurine I'd bought during my city travels, a handmade carving of a fox, no bigger than my palm. I hiked a short distance into the woods, my heart pattering all the way, until I found a mossy boulder near a cluster of pines. There, I placed the little fox figurine, along with a small chunk of bread as an offering. I murmured something like, "I'm here in peace. Please, let me live here safely." It felt silly, but also strangely relieving. The wind sighed, stirring the pine needles overhead. I stood there, uncertain, until goosebumps from the cold forced me back to the cabin. That night, I left the porch light on, a dim glow powered by my generator. No scratching, no footsteps. I slept almost through the night for the first time since arriving, but 2 nights later I woke to howling. It started softly, rising and falling like a chant. My chest tightened. I grabbed my lantern, threw on boots, and stepped out onto the porch. A dense fog clung to the ground, swirling in the faint light. The howling echoed as if it came from every direction, weaving among the trees. My hands shook. I managed to whisper, "I mean no harm," though my voice cracked. The howling crescendoed, then abruptly stopped. Just stopped, leaving me in suffocating silence. I searched with my flashlight, but the fog revealed nothing. Standing there, heart pounding, I recalled the shape I'd seen among the trees my first evening. The footprints, the scratches. Something out there was testing me, or so I believed. Either I met it head on, or I lived in perpetual fear. I breathed in the cold air, leveling my voice. I'm not leaving. This is my home now. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes glinting in the fog, but they vanished too quickly to be sure. The hush pressed down. In the morning, the forest seemed normal again. Birds chirping, squirrels scurrying. If it wasn't for my frayed nerves and racing pulse, I'd have thought I dreamed the whole night's event. Over the next few weeks, I continued my small ritual, leaving tokens or bits of bread or flowers in that mossy spot, offering respect with a few murmured words. Gradually, the eerie occurrences tapered off. No more bare footprints. No more scratch marks. The nights stayed quiet, though the wind sometimes whistled in the hollows, and once I glimpsed a silhouette near the cliff's edge at sunset. I felt no hostility from it, just an ancient watchfulness. Even the old fear in me softened, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. Late in November, my sister Rory visited, managing the rutted trail in her battered sedan. She brought me groceries, asked 1,000 worried questions, but seemed a little relieved that I looked calmer than she'd expected. We spent 2 nights together, stoking the wood stove, sipping tea, and listening to the wind. I didn't tell her everything. I was afraid she'd think I'd lost it, but I did mention hearing strange sounds at night, and she teased me about hillbilly ghost stories. I laughed along, letting her skepticism be enough. When she left, the forest felt emptier, but not unwelcoming. By December, the hush of winter set in. Snow flurries dusted the ridges. The days grew short, and an early dusk bathed the cabin in cold twilight. Yet, I felt surprisingly at peace. I gathered and chopped firewood, maintained my small generator, and found a trickle of contentment in daily tasks. Occasionally, I'd sense an uncanny presence in the trees, a flash of movement or faint footfalls. But each time, I murmured a greeting or left a token, and nothing threatened me. One crisp morning, I stood on my porch with a mug of steaming coffee, marveling at how the snow changed the landscape. The oak branches looked skeletal, the hemlocks bowing under the frost. A quiet pride filled me. I'd come here broken and scared, unsure if I could handle isolation. But I'd discovered a kind of resolve, recognizing that the land, the ancient hollows, might test me, but they weren't driving me away. Maybe I'd passed some trial. Maybe I'd learned to belong here. In the distance, near the ridge, I thought I spotted a figure, a tall silhouette, standing motionless. My heart fluttered, but not in terror. I raised my coffee in a sort of salute. The figure didn't move. Then, in the space of a blink, it was gone. I smiled to myself. Maybe it was only a trick of light. Or maybe the guardians, the old spirits, had accepted I was no threat. Either way, I wasn't running anymore. When Cliff visited a week later, tramping up the trail to drop off extra firewood, he noticed my calmer demeanor and gave me an approving nod. "Guess you've settled in," he said, scanning the cabin. I told him I felt at peace, more or less. He patted my shoulder like a proud teacher. "It's how it goes. The hills can be harsh at first, but they got their own sense of fairness if you learn to listen." I took his words to heart. Sometimes at night, I recall the footprints, the howling, that sense of creeping dread. It lingers, a reminder that I'm a guest in this ancient realm of cliffs and caves. Yet each dawn, the sun rises over the forest, illuminating the huddled pines, revealing a world that's wild and alive, but not necessarily hostile. I feed the wood stove, fix a cup of coffee, and step onto the porch to breathe in the hush. In that hush, I've found a quiet strength. The heartbreak that pushed me here still aches, but the land's mysterious vigilance has become my silent companion. The guardians might watch from the shadows, but they no longer frighten me. Instead, they remind me that every soul, human or otherwise, seeks a home that lets it heal. So I stay in these ridges and hollows, forging a slow truce with the old spirits of Hocking Hills. My cabin stands firm despite the winter snows. The wood stove keeps me warm, and at night I sometimes leave a small carved token by the mossy boulder, whispering my gratitude. I may never fully grasp what truly moves among these trees, but I've learned not to tremble before the unknown. Here, among the rugged cliffs and ancient forest, I found the quiet I needed, and in that quiet, I'm learning to find myself again. I was barely halfway up the gravel driveway when the anxiety kicked in. My palms slick on the steering wheel, my chest squeezed tight. The property on the Ohio side of the river was nothing but overgrown farmland and a run-down barn leaning under its own weight, but it was the only place I could afford. Or, more accurately, the only place I wanted. My sister told me I should pick somewhere lively, with neighbors nearby, so I wouldn't be alone after the discharge. But that was the whole point. I wanted to be alone. I parked my old truck by the sagging barn, staring out at the land before me. The fields rolled gently, ending at a stand of trees that walled off the Ohio River from view. The late afternoon sun shimmered on the horizon, telling me I needed to unload soon if I wanted to set up my generator and lights before dark. This was it, my new start. A battered trailer home perched on farmland that no one else seemed to want, just across the water from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. As I climbed out, the evening breeze carried the tang of mud and river water. It was almost comforting in its own way. I'd served 2 tours overseas, and ever since coming back, city noises felt too sharp and crowded. My PTSD episodes had gotten worse in tight spaces. Now, in the open sprawl of farmland, I told myself the air might clear my head. I popped the tailgate and hauled out a couple of heavy boxes. Canned goods mostly, some old clothes, a handful of books, a small generator that would power the trailer until I got a better setup for solar. Stacking them next to the trailer's flimsy steps, I glanced at the sky, noticing dark clouds gathering from the west. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Typical. The farm was known to flood a bit, especially if the rain was heavy. Maybe I'd have to rig up some drainage soon. Grunting, I dragged the first box inside. The trailer smelled musty, like no one had lived here in a while. Dust motes danced in a ray of sunlight that slanted through a cracked window. I set the box on the peeling linoleum floor. Not exactly homey, but I didn't need comfort. I needed solitude, a place to get my head straight. An hour later, I'd wrestled the generator into place behind the trailer and run an extension cord inside. Just as I was finishing, a battered pickup rolled up the driveway, spraying gravel. My pulse flickered. I wasn't expecting visitors, and part of me tensed at the thought of confrontation. But when the driver's door opened, out stepped a uniformed figure. Officer Hicks, I guessed, because a local policeman had left a message with the realtor that he'd swing by to check on me. Great. So much for anonymity. He gave a friendly nod. Brendan Cole? That's me, I said, forcing a polite tone. Name's Hicks. I patrol this stretch of county. Figured I'd welcome you. He eyed my generator. New arrival, huh? Farm's been empty since old man Millard passed, so I was curious who'd take it. I shrugged. Needed space. His gaze wandered to the barn. That structure's near collapse. Watch yourself. If a big storm hits, the roof might cave. Last thing we need is a call about you pinned under rotten timbers. I tried to muster a smile. I'll be careful. He nodded, squinting at the darkening sky. Weather gets rough along the river. If you see high water rising, don't wait. Drive out. He paused, fiddling with his hat. Some folks find it lonely out here. If you need anything, medical, supplies, or just a friendly face, you can call the station. Thanks, I managed. My chest felt tight again. Friendly as he was, I wanted him gone, so I could finish settling in. He seemed to pick up on my tension. All right, you take care. He tipped his hat, climbed back into his truck, and headed off, leaving me standing in a swirl of dust. Rain began spitting as I dragged the last of my stuff inside. The wind picked up, rattling the trailer's thin walls. I rummaged for my flashlight, flicking it on to check that the windows were sealed. Lightning flashed, revealing farmland that stretched like a gray sea of swaying weeds. In the distance, across the river, I saw the faint outline of the bridge leading into Point Pleasant. Another rumble of thunder, this one closer. That night, I tried to sleep with the storm pounding on the roof, my head filled with half-remembered images from old war zones. Every thunderclap felt like mortars. Each flicker of lightning made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted, but at least I was still here. The farmland was soaked, though, puddles forming near the barn. I'd have to do something about that. The next few days passed with me settling into a routine. I hammered boards over the barn's worst holes, hoping to buy it time before it caved. I trudged through the soggy fields, noting where the ground dipped low, turning into pools after storms. I planned to plant some vegetables eventually, maybe keep a few chickens. Self-sufficiency. That was the dream anyway. In the evenings, once I'd rigged a lantern and a small lamp off my generator, I'd sit on the trailer's rickety porch, listening to frogs croak by the river, letting the quietness wash over me. After the chaos of city rehab centers and my last meltdown in therapy, the hush felt almost too big, like it might swallow me. But I persevered, reminding myself this was better than the alternative. Flashbacks triggered by everyday city noises. One of those nights while I was nursing a mug of instant coffee, I spotted something odd. 2 red lights gliding above the river. At first, I thought they were from a plane, but they moved too erratically, dipping low near the water before zipping upward. My pulse kicked. Drones, maybe? But the lights were bigger, spaced apart like eyes. I stood, coffee forgotten. The lights hovered for a moment, then vanished behind the tree line. I shivered, telling myself it must be some trick of reflection, or maybe a couple of local kids messing around. The next day, I tried to forget about it. Someone else's drone, right? But that night, the same red orbs appeared, weaving across the dark sky. No buzzing sound like a drone, though, just an eerie silence. And then thunder rolled in again, wind whipping the tall grass. By the time I squinted through the gusts, the lights were gone. After a week of living here, I decided I needed to explore the small town upriver. The farmland was in the outskirts of a county seat, but the nearest cluster of shops was across the bridge near Point Pleasant. So I hopped into my truck and followed the winding road along the Ohio River, eventually crossing over into West Virginia territory. The sign read, "Welcome to Point Pleasant, home of the Mothman." I'd heard the legends vaguely. A giant winged creature with red eyes that terrorized the area decades ago, culminating in that tragic Silver Bridge collapse. But I'd never thought much of it. People spun cryptid stories all the time. In town, I grabbed some groceries, a better flashlight, and an old used radio so I could pick up weather alerts. That was when I met Deb Turner, caretaker of the local historical society. She was stocking shelves in a corner store, wearing a name tag that identified her part-time job. We got chatting because she noticed my empty cart had a box of earplugs. Thought maybe I was a musician. I explained it was for my PTSD, how loud noises still spooked me. She frowned sympathetically. "You live near the river, across in Ohio?" she asked. I nodded. "A small farm, not far from the water." She perked up. "Have you seen anything odd at night? Like red lights in the sky?" My stomach did a small flip. "Why do you ask?" She gave a knowing smile. I keep track of Mothman sightings for the Historical Society. Folks around here claim it's real, or at least something is. The red, glowing eyes are the biggest clue. I forced a laugh that sounded hollow, even to me. I saw red lights, but I figured they were drones or something. Deb shook her head. Might be, but if you see it again, let me know. Some folks say the creature crosses the river and roosts in old barns. That piece of information stuck with me all the way back to the trailer. A roost in old barns. My barn was half collapsed and overshadowed by tall sycamores. Perfect place for an oversized bird, if such a thing existed. I told myself not to let local legends creep me out. But that night, the red lights returned, dancing over the water, inching near my property before vanishing. I couldn't sleep, mind churning with images of a winged shape perched on the barn roof. Officer Hicks stopped by again one afternoon, claiming he was just doing his rounds. He saw me clearing brush near the barn and hopped out to say hello. Something in me suspected he also wanted to check on my mental state. Maybe he'd heard about my background from the realtor, or he just recognized the signs of an ex-soldier with too many ghosts. After some small talk, I finally asked, "You ever see weird lights around here at night?" He paused, exhaling. "You mean the Mothman stuff?" I shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "I guess." Hicks gave a reluctant nod. "I've heard locals talk. Some say they spot red eyes near the treetops, or a large silhouette around farmland. I've never seen it myself, but I've gotten calls about it. Usually turn out to be hawks with reflective eyes, or kids messing around. But sometimes folks swear otherwise." I dug the toe of my boot into the dirt. "So there's no official explanation?" He shrugged. "Nope. If you see anything real suspicious, let me know. Meanwhile, stay inside if storms get too bad. The wind can pick up quick along the river." I thanked him, though he left me feeling uneasy. If the local cop didn't have a rational explanation, what chance did I have? Days turned into weeks. I established a routine. Up at dawn, do small repairs, maintain the generator, try to rework the drainage near the barn. Evenings, I'd force myself to relax on the porch with a warm drink, letting the farmland's quiet envelop me. My nightmares still came, usually triggered by loud thunder or a passing truck's backfire. But the open fields gave me room to breathe. The red lights, though, they became more frequent. Stormy nights, especially. I'd see them darting over the river, sometimes swooping low as if surveying the farmland. A couple of times, I heard a whoosh of wind overhead, like massive wings beating the air, though I never caught sight of anything more than a fleeting shadow. I felt torn between fear and a strange fascination. Was it possible this was actually the Mothman, or some cryptid, crossing from Point Pleasant into Ohio, drawn by storms or sorrow? Part of me wanted to call Deb at the Historical Society, but my pride kept me from it. I didn't want to sound like I was losing my grip. One late evening, as thunderheads loomed, I decided to confront the phenomenon. The forecast promised a severe storm. I set up a folding chair near the barn so I had a clear view of the sky, armed with my flashlight and a camera phone. Lightning flashed in the distance. The wind gusted, stirring the high grass in restless waves. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging, though I couldn't say if I was more terrified or thrilled. Eventually, the storm broke overhead. Sheets of rain hammered the tin roof of the barn, lightning strobing across the fields. I squinted through the downpour, breath shallow. Then, right as I contemplated giving up, I heard it, a heavy flap, like sails catching wind. My eyes darted upward. There, silhouetted against a burst of lightning, were two massive wings, and in the center, a pair of glowing red orbs that I swear stared right back at me. My mind blanked in shock. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight in the mud. The wings beat again, creating a gust of wind that tore at my jacket. For half a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shape land on the barn roof, a tall, hunched figure with eyes ablaze. Rain blinded me, but I forced myself to look up, trying to see if it was truly there or just a lightning hallucination. Another lightning strike, illuminating empty space. The roof was bare, but the thunderclap that followed roared like a warning. I stood there, soaked, trembling. The camera phone I'd meant to record with sat in my pocket, useless. My mind had been too stunned to film. I turned, stumbling back to the trailer. Inside, I ripped off my drenched coat, adrenaline spiking every nerve. Part of me wanted to run to the truck, drive away, never return. Another part insisted on staying. This was my land now, my attempt at a life. If a winged creature, Mothman or not, wanted to scare me off, I wasn't giving up so easily. I spent the night wide awake, every thunderclap making me flinch, thoughts spinning about what I'd seen. Morning came with gray skies, but calmer wind. I forced myself outside, scanning the barn roof. No footprints, no sign of claws, nothing. The only evidence was my soggy folding chair and the churned mud where I'd dropped my flashlight. I called Deb Turner that afternoon, my voice shaking as I told her about the silhouette, the red eyes. She listened intently, not mocking or disbelieving. "You're not alone," she said. "Reports like yours have popped up for decades. Some think Mothman is drawn to tragedies or intense emotions." Then she added gently, "Are you sure you're okay mentally? I know you have a military background." I grimaced, feeling exposed. "I'm not imagining this," I said, maybe too defensively. She apologized if she offended me. We agreed that if I saw it again, I'd try to gather evidence, though she cautioned me to stay safe. Winter's edge crept closer, the farmland browning under frosts. My PTSD still flared, but the open space helped me breathe better. The image of that winged silhouette haunted me. On nights when storms brewed, I'd watch the sky, half hoping I wouldn't see it, half wishing I would. A twisted fascination, born from my own craving to prove I wasn't delusional. Finally, on a clear, cold evening near mid-December, I ventured down to the river's edge. The moon glowed over the water, turning the currents silver. I stood on the muddy bank, hugging my coat tight. The night was so quiet, I heard each ripple and every distant frog croak. Then, out of nowhere, a soft rustle overhead. My heart jumped as I spotted those red lights, gliding silently across the sky, heading from the West Virginia side toward me. I froze, moonlight shimmering on the creature's outline. Wings, definitely. A slight reflection of the moon on what looked like a leathery or feathery span. The red eyes flickered, almost blinking. It coasted along the far edge of my farmland, then slowly descended near the water. My chest felt like it might burst. I forced myself to step forward, each footstep squishing in mud. If I could get closer. Suddenly, the creature landed on a half-submerged log near the riverbank, maybe 50 yards away. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, tall, with wings folded behind it. Those eyes glowed like embers, fixed in my direction. My limbs trembled, but I raised my hand in a shaky gesture, as if to show I was unarmed. A wave of fear battled with a strange empathy. I knew what it felt like to be wounded, lost. Could this being be the same? We stared at each other across the water. The night air seemed to throb with tension, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then, without warning, the creature unfurled its wings, massive arcs that cut through the moonlight. A single beat launched it skyward, droplets of water spraying off the log. The red eyes lingered in my vision like after-images. It soared over me, and I swore I felt a rush of wind on my face, a sense of uncanny power passing by. Then it was gone, gliding upriver and vanishing into darkness. My legs nearly buckled. A wave of relief and awe swept through me. No aggression, no attempt to harm, Just two lost beings crossing paths under the moon. I stumbled back to my trailer, mind buzzing with 1,000 questions. In the days that followed, my nightmares eased. It was like seeing that creature face to face shifted something inside me. Maybe it recognized my own pain, or maybe that's just me grasping at meaning, but I felt calmer. Even the farmland felt friendlier, the barn less ominous. I patched up a few holes, started a small greenhouse project. If Mothman was real, I decided, it wasn't out to tear me apart. Maybe it just roamed these skies, drawn by the quiet heartbreak in the fields. Officer Hicks came by again, noticing my change in demeanor. I told him I was sleeping better. He said that was good and didn't pry. Deb called, asking if I'd had more sightings. I admitted I did, but couldn't quite put it into words for her. She asked if I'd show her the spot by the river one day. I said maybe, though I wasn't sure I wanted to share that secret place. The Ohio River rolled on, winter deepened, and I stayed, my farmland becoming something akin to therapy. The red eyes still appeared on stormy nights, or sometimes on a bright evening with a full moon. But I no longer trembled at the sight. I'd watch from my porch, letting my breath steady. On rare occasions, the creature would dip low near the barn, then vanish. Whether it was truly Mothman, or just a winged cryptid with luminous eyes, I accepted it as a neighbor, a spectral sentinel in these borderlands. Sometimes, just before dawn, I'd step outside to see the sky turning purple over the West Virginia hills. I'd remember the heat of combat zones, the screams, the sleepless nights that nearly destroyed me. But then I'd feel the quiet farmland under my boots, smell the cool morning air off the river, and see the faint impression of tracks that might be talons or just my imagination. And I'd feel, for the first time in a long while, that I could live with my past, that maybe I wasn't condemned to run from the ghosts in my own head. Let the old folks call it Mothman, call it an omen or a myth. For me, it became a reminder that even the most damaged of us can find a place to land. Briefly, uncertainly, but enough to endure another day. I never captured photos, never posted sensational stories online. Some nights I'd lay awake, half hoping it would return, half dreading the rush of adrenaline if it did. But always at sunrise, the farmland greeted me, silent and stoic, encouraging me to keep going, keep healing. If someone asked me now if Mothman is real, I'd just smile. I know what I saw, a winged silhouette, eyes glowing red, crossing the Ohio River in the hush of the night. But more than that, I felt acceptance. Maybe it recognized a fellow wounded soul, or maybe I read too much into it. Either way, I'm still here, rebuilding my life on this off-grid farm. The barn's still leaning, the trailer's still leaky, but my nightmares don't rule me anymore. And whenever thunder gathers in the distance, or the moon hangs low, I wonder if those wings might skim the skies once again, reminding me that even the darkest creatures can share a silent peace under the same wide heavens. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, listening to the engine sputter into silence. All around me, fields of corn stretched across a flat Ohio horizon, the tall stalks swaying in a gentle breeze. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves soak into my ears. I'd driven from the city at dawn, my SUV crammed with every scrap of my gardening equipment, determined to claim this rural plot near Upper Sandusky as the new start I so desperately needed. I used to be an urban gardener, cultivating vegetables on rooftops and community plots. But city rent soared, and I'd grown exhausted by the hustle. A few months back, my friend Mia Rossi, who shared my dream of a farm-to-table business, helped finance a small piece of farmland out here in Ohio. We planned to transform these acres into a thriving organic enterprise. No more cramped planters or negotiating public space. I'd have a full farm at my disposal. But now that I was actually here, the endless ocean of corn made my heart lurch with excitement and something darker, an unease I couldn't quite name. I chalked it up to nerves, the remnants of city stress, and climbed out of the SUV. The afternoon sun hit me in a wave of heat. Cicadas buzzed in the background, an incessant hum. I glanced at the rundown farmhouse in the distance. Chipped paint, a sagging porch, but workable. Next to it stood a squat barn, the roof patched with mismatched shingles. Beyond that, row after row of cornstalks loomed tall as giants, forming walls of green that blocked any sense of horizon. I hadn't expected so much corn. Then again, the farmland's previous owner had apparently grown nothing else for years. I grabbed a box labeled Kitchen and Seeds from the trunk and carted it toward the house. Each step sounded too loud in the hush. A few crows cawed somewhere unseen, making my pulse jump. I mentally reminded myself that this was farmland, not some horror movie. Birds caw, insects buzz. That's just nature. Inside, the farmhouse felt stuffy and abandoned. I flicked a light switch out of habit. Nothing. Of course, the electricity wasn't hooked up yet. I left the front door open to let in air, though all it did was carry more of that pungent, sweet smell of corn. A swirl of dust caught the sunlight, stinging my eyes. "All right, Evelyn," I muttered to myself. "You chose this. Embrace it." I spent the afternoon hauling boxes, hooking up a small generator I'd brought for basic power, and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that washed over me every time I glanced at the cornfields. I'm used to urban spaces, tall buildings, bus stops. The quiet out here felt unnerving. Late in the day, I spotted a figure at the edge of the fields. I tensed, eyes narrowing. The figure waved, and I raised my hand in a stiff greeting. It was an older man, maybe late 50s, wearing overalls and a baseball cap. He trudged through the rows and stopped a few yards from my porch. "Howdy," he said, tilting his cap. "Name's Lester Hahn. I own the farm next property over." I blew out a breath, relieved he wasn't some drifter. "I'm Evelyn," I said, stepping off the porch to meet him. "Just moved in." He nodded, taking in the peeling paint of the farmhouse, the barn's crooked roof, then the endless corn. "You planning to keep that corn going or switch to something else?" I wiped sweat from my brow. "I'm an organic grower, so I was hoping to do vegetables, maybe a mix of fruit trees. The previous owner left the corn, but it's too dense and it's not even the variety I'd want." Lester studied me with a look I couldn't read. "Might be wise to harvest or mow it down soon. Cornfields can hide all sorts of trouble if you let 'em. Critters, sure, but sometimes bigger nuisances." I gave a shaky laugh. "Well, I do plan to clear it eventually. Takes time, though. I just got here." He nodded again, more serious this time. "You be careful at dusk. Sometimes folks say they hear strange noises from the fields. Could be coyotes. Could be people up to no good." He shrugged. "Anyway, you holler if you need help." I watched him amble off, his shoulders hunched. Already he was just a silhouette against the looming corn. Something about his warning unsettled me. I turned back to the farmhouse, forcing my mind to practicalities, hooking up a makeshift shower, finding my sleeping bag so I could at least rest tonight. By the time darkness fell, I'd cleared enough space in the living room for a cot and set up my lantern. The generator purred softly outside, giving me a single lamp in the kitchen. I ate a quick sandwich and collapsed onto the cot, exhausted. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind whispered through the rows of corn, producing a rustling that sounded almost like hushed voices. More than once I sat up, ears straining. Probably just the wind. Right? Morning arrived with a hazy sun, the smell of damp earth seeping through the windows. Determined to get a handle on my new empire, I ventured into the fields to see how extensive they were. My boots crunched on the soft soil, each step sinking slightly. The cornstalks towered above me, blocking the sky. After a few yards, I could barely see the house. An uneasy claustrophobia settled in, like I was entering a labyrinth. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. No birds, no insects, just the muffled sound of my own breathing. Suddenly, a muffled thud made me jump. I turned, heart pounding. A crow exploded from the stalks, cawing like it was scolding me. "Just a bird," I mumbled, exhaling. But then I nearly tripped over something. I glanced down to see a crudely made scarecrow lying on the ground, its straw limbs twisted, an old burlap sack for a head. Why was it on the ground? The previous owner must have left it there. I forced a laugh at my own jumpiness. Reaching down, I tried to prop the scarecrow against a row of stalks so it wouldn't block the path. Its button eyes and stitched mouth gave me the creeps, though. Once it stood, leaning crookedly, I hurried on my way. About midday, Mia called. The signal barely reached inside the house, so I had to stand on the porch. "How's the new farm?" she asked, her voice crackling. "Overwhelming," I admitted. "The cornfields are insane. I'm definitely going to mow them down soon." She laughed. "Don't get lost in there. And be careful. I heard stories about farmland out in Ohio. Lots of spooky stuff. My grandma was from around there, used to talk about curses and witches." I rolled my eyes, though a shiver ran up my spine. "I'll manage," I said, hoping I sounded confident. "Thanks for the concern." That evening, as the sun dipped below the rose, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter to get a sense of the property lines. The sky glowed orange, painting the cornstalks in a surreal light. Halfway around, I noticed a figure standing among the rows. Another scarecrow, I thought. But didn't I see it in a different spot earlier? I stepped closer, curiosity prickling. Sure enough, it was a scarecrow. Only this one wore a tattered shirt and had a crude straw hat jammed on its head. I could have sworn it wasn't here yesterday. Maybe I just missed it, but something about it felt off, like it had been placed hurriedly. The stitching around the mouth formed a jagged grin. I shuddered. I'd never liked scarecrows, but at least they were meant to keep birds away. At nightfall, the wind picked up, rustling the corn so loudly it almost sounded like screaming. My imagination, obviously. But around midnight, I jolted awake to the sound of actual screams. Or so I thought. Heart hammering, I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside. The moon was bright, casting the farmland in silver. The cornstalks hissed in the breeze, but no screams. Just silence. I stood there in my pajamas, scanning the darkness. Then I caught a glimpse of movement. A scarecrow, perched on a wooden stake near the barn, except it hadn't been there before. My pulse raced. Had someone put it there as a prank? Or was it always there and I overlooked it? I took a hesitant step forward. The figure was still as death, straw arms pinned out, the burlap head sagging. I forced a chuckle at my own jumpiness. The wind must have carried some strange noise. The following morning, I found Lester Hahn poking around near my porch. He looked grim. "You all right?" he asked. "Heard some racket last night, but I wasn't sure if it was you or just the wind." I admitted I thought I heard screaming, but it must have been wind through the corn. Lester frowned. "This place has a reputation, you know. Old rumor says a witch cursed the land ages ago. Folks only half believe it. But if you hear screaming at night, well," he trailed off. I swallowed. "That's superstitious nonsense, right?" He shrugged, glancing at the barn. "Might be. Just keep your eyes open. Some folks say illusions plague this farm if you're not careful. Shadows, scarecrows shifting, that kind of thing." Over the next few days, that's exactly what kept happening. Scarecrows popping up in new locations, half of them looking older than dirt with frayed burlap, some with bizarrely stitched features. Once or twice, I found footprints in the muddy patches near the barn. too large to be mine, yet shaped oddly. The dogs from town, maybe, but no, they looked human. I tried to plow into the corn to start clearing it, but the old tractor coughed and died, refusing to hold a charge. My attempts at mowing small sections with a push mower were laughable. The stalks were too dense. It felt like the land resisted me. One afternoon, while rummaging in the barn, I stumbled upon a stack of old crates and a rotted trunk. Curiosity drove me to open it. Inside lay musty papers, a tarnished locket, and a small leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle and stained, but I managed to read a few lines. Something about a dark presence in the fields, about an old woman accused of witchcraft, and the phrase, "The talisman to bind her was hidden here, to keep the land safe." My heart pounded. It sounded like local folklore, but I couldn't ignore how it lined up with Lester's talk of a curse and illusions. Maybe this was just local legend, or maybe there was more to it. I read on, trying to decipher smudged ink. Should the talisman be moved or destroyed, her wrath returns. The harvest fails. The scarecrows come to life. I nearly dropped the journal. The scarecrows, my daily torment. Could this be connected, or was I letting my imagination run wild? Still, the words gave me a chill. If there really was some old talisman, maybe I could remove it, or bury it, or something to stop these weird happenings. Night fell, and with it came a heavy fog rolling across the fields. The barn lights flickered, as if the generator struggled. I huddled inside the farmhouse, reading the journal by lamplight. It mentioned a hidden chamber in the barn floor, presumably where the talisman was stored centuries ago. My gut twisted. Should I go look now, in the dark? That seemed like a recipe for more nightmares. But the moment I heard that scream-like wind again, my fear turned to determination. I grabbed my lantern and marched to the barn. The structure loomed. Half swallowed by the swirling fog, a single scarecrow propped outside the double doors. Its stitched face seemed to leer at me. Inside, the barn smelled of must and old straw. My lantern light danced across broken tools, a pile of rotting hay bales, the dusty trunk I'd opened earlier. I knelt on the creaky floorboards, searching for any sign of a hidden hatch. Sure enough, near the center, I found a loose plank. Carefully, I pried it up with a crowbar. My heart thudded in my ears as I revealed a shallow cavity, barely large enough to fit a person's arm. Reaching in, I felt something cold and metallic. My fingers closed around a small object, pulling it out into the lantern light. It was a pendant, roughly fashioned from iron, shaped like a twisted spiral. My breath caught. The journal's scribbled line echoed in my mind. The talisman to bind her was hidden here. At that exact moment, a breeze swept through the barn, extinguishing my lantern. I froze in the sudden darkness, talisman clutched in my hand. Outside, the rustle of corn sounded more frantic, and behind me, a heavy footstep scraped the dirt floor. Or was that my imagination? "Hello?" I whispered, voice trembling. No answer, but I sensed a presence. A shape shifted in the corner, and my nerve nearly snapped. I scrambled to relight my lantern, the flint sparking. Finally, a weak flame caught, revealing empty shadows. No human figure, no monster. But I couldn't quell the prickling terror. Clutching the talisman, I fled the barn, determined to return to the house. As I stepped onto the yard, I realized the scarecrow that stood outside the barn door was gone. A fresh wave of panic soared through me. I spun around with the lantern. Nothing. The cornstalks hissed in the wind. Sprinting back to the farmhouse, I barricaded the door, my heart pounding so loud I thought I'd pass out. I tried to rationalize everything. The scarecrow must have fallen, or maybe I'd imagined it. But my gut told me otherwise. I collapsed on the living room floor, panting, the talisman clenched in my fist. That night, The screams in the fields were unmistakable, louder, almost human. I refused to leave the house. Through the windows, I saw flickers of movement near the edges of the corn, silhouettes that seemed to limp or stagger, as if they were scarecrows come to life. My mind reeled. The old journal said removing the talisman might unleash the curse again. Perhaps I'd made it worse by taking it. At dawn, I found corn husks scattered around the porch, arranged in a spiral pattern that mirrored the shape of the iron pendant. My stomach churned. Desperate, I called Mia, my voice cracking as I explained the strange happenings. She thought I was losing it. Who could blame her? But she also heard the raw fear in my words and promised to drive down. By midday, Mia arrived, face pale as she took in the farmland's eerie atmosphere. I showed her the talisman, the journal. She didn't mock me. Instead, she said, "If this is a curse, maybe we have to put it back or do something to break it." We huddled over the journal, deciphering the archaic script. It hinted that the original owners placed the talisman in the barn to keep the witch's spirit trapped. If it was removed, one needed to cleanse the land, whatever that meant. Another line read, "Salt, herb, and fire may banish her. Return the pendant to the cradle of sorrow and burn the remains." I had no idea what that referred to, but we scrambled to piece it together. Lester showed up later, concerned by our panicked demeanor. We told him about the scarecrows, the screams, the talisman. He turned pale, muttering that his grandpa mentioned a witch cursing farmland. "If I were you," he said in a low tone, "I'd put that thing back where you found it and say some prayers." But the journal made it clear that just returning it wouldn't stop the curse if we'd already unleashed it. We needed to burn something. The question was what? Then Mia noticed a line about a shrine of straw and cloth. We looked at each other, minds clicking. The scarecrows, possibly formed from the witch's presence. That evening, Mia and I marched into the barn with salt, a handful of sage, and a lighter. My heart hammered as we approached the spot in the floor. I placed the talisman back inside, but it felt like cold dread seeped into my bones. Outside, the wind picked up, and we heard moaning from the fields, like a chorus of tortured voices. We sprinkled salt around the hidden cavity, lit sage, chanting half-remembered phrases from the journal. The wind howled, as if furious. Then we backed out, focusing on the scarecrows. If they were conduits of the curse, maybe burning them would break the bond. We snatched up the nearest one, dragging its limp form into the open. The sky roiled with dark clouds, lightning crackling. Even Lester, who'd joined us, looked terrified. Setting the scarecrow on a patch of dirt, we doused it with a bit of kerosene, then struck a match. The flames whooshed up, sending sparks into the night. Almost immediately, an unholy shriek echoed through the fields, chilling my blood. The cornstalks thrashed, and I caught glimpses of other scarecrows stumbling at the edge of the property, jerking like puppets. "This is insane," Mia yelled, voice drowned out by wind. But we pressed on, grabbing each scarecrow we found, torn burlap, straw limbs, twisted faces, and hurling them into the fire. With each one burned, the screaming from the fields grew louder, more frantic, until it peaked in a piercing wail. Then, abruptly, the wind died. The fire crackled, sending black smoke curling into the night sky. Silence closed in, broken only by our ragged breathing. One by one, the scarecrows in the distance sagged, as if their animating force vanished. They collapsed to the ground, no longer moving. We doused the flames carefully. My body shook from adrenaline. It felt like the entire night had been a waking nightmare. The sky cleared, revealing stars overhead. The hush was eerie but not threatening, just the quiet of farmland at rest. In the morning light, we discovered the cornstalks still, not a whisper of unnatural movement. The footprints near the barn were gone, replaced by normal tracks from our boots. Mia and I returned to the hidden space in the barn. The talisman remained, but it felt inert now, as if the malevolent charge had drained away. We decided to bury it deeper beneath fresh earth, layering salt around it just to be safe. Lester helped us pull the rest of the dead scarecrows from the fields and burn them in a final pyre. No more shrieks, no more illusions. When the ashes cooled, the farmland felt different, lighter, as though a tension had lifted. We stood by the smoldering embers, shoulders slumped with relief. Mia left that evening, satisfied we'd faced whatever curse had plagued the farm. Before she drove off, she squeezed my hand. "You're going to be okay here, Evelyn. The land's yours now, truly." I watched her taillights vanish down the dirt road, a knot loosening in my chest. The fields no longer felt hostile. I could almost imagine a faint breeze carrying a sigh of release, as if the farmland thanked me for freeing it from an ancient darkness. Or maybe that's just my imagination. Over the weeks that followed, I gradually mowed the corn, preparing the soil for the vegetables I'd dreamed of planting. The nights stayed peaceful. No screams, no scarecrows creeping around. Sometimes I'd find a random straw arm in the far reaches of the property, left over from the old scarecrows, but I'd toss it on a burn pile and move on. The farmhouse no longer felt haunted. It felt like a place where I could finally grow roots. Lester checked in occasionally, a hint of respect in his gaze. We never talked directly about witches or curses again, but he'd nod at me with a small grin, like we shared a secret. Mia visited on weekends to discuss our plans for a roadside produce stand. Maybe eventually a CSA subscription. The land might have a grim history, but it was mine to shape. Sometimes at twilight, I stand at the barn's threshold, recalling those frantic nights. A breeze ruffles the grass, but it carries no moans, no illusions of scarecrows lurching through the fields. I think about that old journal in the trunk, about the lines referencing a witch's wrath. Maybe it was just folklore entwined with real fear, but I can't deny what I saw. The scarecrows that moved, the screams that tore through the darkness. In the end, I keep that memory close, a reminder that nature can hold secrets older than any city block, but also a reminder that dedication and a little courage can break even the oldest curses. If the farmland stands calm now, it's because I fought for it, and in return, it's letting me grow something new, something alive and hopeful. Tomorrow, I'll till the western plot, sow the first seeds of onions and kale. I'll watch the soil for signs of healthy sprouting. When I see those tender green shoots emerge, I'll know I've done right by this land. The nightmares of that first week remain a lesson. Respect the land's hidden stories, but don't let them drive you away. Here, amid the rolling fields and hushed rows, I've found a place to plant my future. And no scarecrow, no centuries-old curse will keep me from reaping the harvest I came here to find. I never realized how silent abandoned lands could be until I stood outside my run-down cottage near the old coal mine outside Nelsonville. There's a certain hush that falls over places once buzzing with machinery and life, as though the earth itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what we do next. I'd come here hoping to help the land recover. Instead, it felt like the land was watching me, sizing me up, deciding if I had the right to stay. The cottage was barely habitable when I found it, a crumbling porch, boards eaten by termites, and a roof patched so haphazardly I feared the first big storm would tear it away. But it was close to the old mine, exactly where I wanted to be. My plan was to live off solar panels and well water, monitoring the soil for contamination, slowly replanting native trees, anything to restore a place once scarred by industry. I'd grown tired of conferences, protests, and city offices ignoring me. I wanted to do real work on the ground, even if it meant living in a near ruin. On my first morning in the cottage, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the cracked window. Light streamed through dusty curtains, illuminating the battered furniture left behind by whoever owned this place decades ago. My sleeping bag on the floor felt stiff, and my muscles ached from hauling boxes the night before. Still, I felt an odd excitement. This was my chance to put my ideals into action, one shovel full of soil at a time. After a quick breakfast of canned beans, I threw on my boots and stepped onto the porch. The view was jarring. Ahead lay the scars of the old coal mine, a collapsed entrance, piles of tailings, patches of raw earth where no plant had grown for years. A row of rickety fences marked off sunken areas, where sinkholes threatened to open if you stepped wrong. The morning sun lit the battered land in harsh clarity, revealing every wound. My chest tightened, but not with despair, more a fierce determination to fix what I could. I spent the day taking soil samples, marking them in baggies, scribbling notes in a battered notebook. My background in environmental science gave me a decent idea of what to check for: heavy metals, coal residue, pH imbalance. The cottage's old well pump squeaked in protest as I filled a jug for washing up, but it worked. The water had a faint metallic tang, likely contaminated. Another project for the list. That evening, as dusk settled, I ran a small extension from my solar battery into the cottage so I could power a single lamp. Its yellow glow flickered across walls peppered with ancient wallpaper. I'd just settled on a sagging chair with my notes when a metallic clang echoed from outside. My heart jumped. It sounded like someone banging on rusty metal, faint but distinct. I froze, ears straining. Another clang, then silence. I grabbed my flashlight, stepping carefully off the porch into the twilight. The sky glowed purple, the mine's silhouette looming like a broken tooth. I swept the flashlight beam across rubble piles and twisted scraps of old machinery. Nobody. The wind rustled a cluster of stunted pines, but there was no sign of life. My pulse slowly calmed, but a chill lingered. Likely some rusted metal sheet shifting, I told myself, or an animal knocking into debris. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the flashlight's reach. A few days later, I met Dakota Willis, the local volunteer who'd answered my call for help with reforestation. She showed up in a dusty pickup, stepping out with a grin that flashed bright against her dark, dirt-smudged face. "Orlando Vega," she called. "I'm Dakota. Heard you needed hands planting trees?" I liked her immediately. Straight to the point, no small talk. I nodded, giving her a brief tour of the cottage and the mine's perimeter. She listened intently as I explained how I wanted to reintroduce certain native saplings, hopefully binding the soil and preventing sinkholes. Dakota frowned, noticing the caved-in mine entrance. A rickety chain-link fence sealed it off with a battered sign reading, "Keep Out." "I've heard stories about that place," she said. "Miners died in a collapse over 100 years ago. Some folks claim it's haunted." I rolled my eyes with a slight laugh. Haunted? Sure. People love ghost stories, especially around old mines. She shrugged. "I've done volunteer work in a couple of reclaimed mine sites. None as eerie as this one, though." She paused, gazing at the boarded-up entrance. "Sometimes at night, people say they hear pickaxes or old machinery clanking." My stomach twisted, remembering the clang I'd heard the other evening. I forced a smile. Probably the wind. Let's focus on the reforestation plan. For the next week, Dakota and I worked side by side, testing soil in areas less toxic to see if saplings could survive. The old tailings made some sections borderline. She cracked jokes, kept morale high, even as we hauled wheelbarrows of compost to build raised mounds for seedlings. It was grueling, sweaty work, but each time we planted a tree, I felt a surge of hope, but the nights grew stranger. On 2 separate occasions, I woke around midnight to the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. By the time I mustered the courage to peek out a window, the noise stopped. Another night, I caught flickers of light near the sealed mine entrance, like lanterns bobbing in the darkness. When I went to investigate, the lights vanished, leaving me breathless and spooked. One morning, while collecting water, I stumbled upon footprints near the chain-link fence. They were footprints, but oddly old-fashioned in shape, like boots from a century ago. The spacing was strange, too, as if the person walked with a laborious shuffle. I knelt, heart pounding. We hadn't ventured this close to the entrance recently. These prints were new. My mind raced with possibilities. Local teenagers playing pranks, or maybe Dakota or someone else I'd never seen. Yet something about them felt off. The soil in that spot was powdery from tailings, so the imprint was crisp, yet the edges had an ancient softness to them, like no real weight pressed down. It defied logic. That afternoon, I asked Dakota if she'd been near the mine. She swore she hadn't. "Look," she said, voice low, "maybe it's time you talk to Jenny Reeves. She's a local historian, knows all about the miners that died here. Might help you understand what's going on." I hesitated, but curiosity won. The next day, I drove into Nelsonville's small downtown, found the old library where Jenny Reeves worked part-time. She was in her 30s, with a quick smile and a cascade of curly hair pinned back. When I mentioned the abandoned mine, her expression turned serious. "I've been researching that mine's history for a while," Jenny said, flipping through a binder of yellowed documents. "Back in the late 1800s, there was a major collapse that trapped about 20 men inside. Some died immediately. Others starved or suffocated before rescuers could reach them." She shook her head. "It was a tragedy. The company moved on, leaving behind debt and heartbreak." I cleared my throat, recalling the strange footprints, the lights, the clanging at night. I wasn't ready to say I believed in ghosts, but I asked, "Have you heard any ghost stories tied to that event?" Jenny's gaze flickered with interest. "Plenty of rumors. People talk about hearing machinery at odd hours, seeing lantern lights as if the miners are still working. Some even claim disembodied voices moaning for rescue. Most locals avoid the area." She gave me a thoughtful look. "You're living up there, aren't you?" I nodded, cheeks flushing. "Trying to reforest the land. But weird things keep happening at night." Jenny grimaced sympathetically. "I'm not surprised. If there are any restless spirits, that mine would be a prime spot for them." She leafed through her papers, extracting a photocopied newspaper clipping. "Says here the miners never got a proper memorial. The owners boarded up the mine entrance, leaving them to rot. Some bodies were never retrieved. Maybe it's guilt or injustice fueling these apparitions." My chest felt heavy. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as folklore. Another part couldn't ignore the evidence. Footprints, phantom lights, the clang of machinery. Is there a way to, I don't know, help them move on? Jenny pursed her lips. "Sometimes in ghost stories, closure comes from acknowledging the dead properly, maybe a vigil or a memorial. Let the spirits know they're not forgotten." It sounded dramatic, but at this point, I was desperate for a solution. "Thanks," I said softly, tucking the clipping into my notebook. I might try something. Beats living with nightly terrors. When I got home, I told Dakota about the plan. She seemed intrigued, if a bit skeptical. "So, what? We hold a candlelight vigil by the mine? Apologize on behalf of greedy coal barons?" I shrugged, lips twisting in a wry smile. "Couldn't hurt. Maybe we place a marker acknowledging the lives lost. Show we respect the land and their sacrifices." She exhaled slowly. "All right, I'm game. If it means fewer creepy noises at night, count me in." We spent the next 2 days preparing. Dakota found a local carpenter to carve a simple wooden plaque with the names of the miners Jenny had uncovered in her research. Meanwhile, I tested the area near the mine entrance, making sure we wouldn't step on a sinkhole. The chain-link fence blocked direct access, but we cleared a small patch of ground a safe distance away. The day we hammered the plaque into place at sunset felt solemn, as if the air itself tensed. That night, we waited until true dark. Jenny joined us, hauling a box of electric lanterns. We set them up in a rough semicircle around the plaque, the sealed mine entrance looming behind. The sky glittered with stars and a sliver of moon hung low. My heart thumped. Would anything actually happen? Dakota cleared her throat and began reading a short piece Jenny wrote, a brief memorial acknowledging the miners' labor and the tragedy of their final hours. I held a single candle, the flame dancing in the gentle breeze. Jenny quietly added some lines from an old newspaper interview with a widow who'd lost her husband in the collapse. The words hung in the night air, heavy with sorrow. We fell silent. For a moment, nothing stirred but the wind through the pines. Then the clang rang out, loud and resounding, like a hammer striking steel. We all startled, turning to the mine entrance. My candle flickered wildly. Another clang echoed, then a faint rumble as though a cart rolled across old tracks. I glanced at Dakota. Her eyes shone with a mixture of fear and wonder. Jenny gripped my arm, face pale. Suddenly, a cluster of lights glowed near the entrance, bobbing like lanterns held by invisible hands. My blood ran cold. The lights drifted closer, illuminating wisps of something. Mist. Or maybe the outlines of figures. I thought I saw a shape stooped, as if pushing a cart. Another figure hunched, holding a pickaxe. I couldn't swallow. In a shaky voice, I raised the candle. "We remember you," I said, heart hammering. "We honor your work, your sacrifice. This land is being restored, and we want to bring it back to life in your memory." My words cracked at the end, a tear slipping down my cheek. A hush fell so profound it felt like the earth stopped spinning. Then the lights flickered, drifting sideways, merging with the shadows. The clang of machinery faded into a whisper. I swore I heard a faint sigh, like relief. For a split second, a figure seemed to stand behind the plaque, tall, wearing a miner's hat, face etched in sorrow. The outline shimmered, then vanished, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost gentle. Dakota let out a trembling breath. "Did we just see that?" she whispered. Jenny nodded slowly, tears in her eyes as well. No one moved for a minute, letting the reality sink in. We had truly encountered something beyond the realm of normal explanation, and it didn't feel malevolent, just achingly sad, longing for acknowledgement. We ended the vigil by placing wildflowers around the plaque, turning off our lanterns one by one. In the darkness, the mine entrance stood silent, no longer looming with menace. The air carried a calm hush. Something had shifted. From that night on, the phantom lights and clangs diminished. I won't say they vanished entirely. Sometimes in the distance I'd still catch a faint echo of pickaxes or a fleeting glow near the collapsed tunnel. But it felt calmer, as though the spirits recognized we were not their enemies. The footprints I occasionally found by the fence no longer alarmed me. I'd just nod and say good morning, as if greeting old friends. With the haunting eased, I could focus more on the reclamation efforts. Dakota and I expanded the tree line, planting saplings in neat rows to stabilize the soil. We tested the cottages well, installed a better filter. Jenny visited now and then, helping document the site's transformation. The nights grew peaceful enough that I sometimes sat on the porch, gazing at the starlit mine, feeling a quiet respect for the land's history and for the souls that lingered. Before winter set in, I hammered a second plaque next to the memorial, describing the reforestation project and dedicating it to the miners who'd lost their lives. The local paper wrote a small article about it. Some folks from Nelsonville came out to see, paying their respects. A small handful claimed they felt chills or heard faint echoes at dusk, but overall the place started radiating a sense of renewal rather than despair. On a crisp autumn evening, I walked the perimeter alone, marveling at the young trees sprouting in once barren soil. My footsteps carried me near the chain-link fence, where the plaque glowed faintly in the moonlight. I paused, recalling the first clang I'd heard, the fear that had gripped me. Now, I felt only gratitude. The land wasn't just a scar. It was a testament to resilience. And maybe, just maybe, the spirits of those miners could finally rest, knowing their story hadn't been forgotten. Sometimes, I still sense them, especially on windy nights, like a presence in the old cottage's corners, or a flicker by the mine entrance. But it's gentle, not haunting, as if they're keeping watch, guiding us as we bring life back to the broken earth they once toiled under. I like to think we made peace. All I know is, for the first time in years, I can stand under the Ohio sky without regret. This battered land, and I share a bond now. We're healing together, forging roots in a place once drowned in sorrow. I still have more work ahead. More saplings, more soil treatments, a better water system. But each sunrise over the reclaimed hills reminds me I'm on the right path. The ghosts of the past walk beside me, not out of vengeance, but out of memory and hope. If this place can bloom again, maybe so can I. And I'll keep their story alive in every tree I plant, every step I take across the soil they once labored in. No longer is the hush of the mine suffocating. It's the gentle hush of reverence for lives lost, for a land reborn. I never knew how heavy fog could truly be until I moved to the edges of Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I'd read about the morning mists that rolled across the ravines, the way they blanketed everything in a milky haze. But knowing something in theory isn't the same as experiencing it. Waking up before dawn, peering out your window, and realizing the entire world has vanished into a swirling gray void. My small cabin, perched on a slight rise just outside the main park boundaries, was supposed to be my refuge. After 30 years as a nurse, 15 of those in a high-intensity hospital unit, I was burned out. A tragic accident involving one of my favorite patients had been the final straw. I couldn't face the sterile corridors or the smell of antiseptic anymore. So I'd taken my savings, found this place, and decided to live off-grid, or at least half off-grid, while tending a tiny orchard I'd dreamed of planting. A new chapter, away from the chaos. The cabin had once been a weekend getaway for some wealthy family, but they gave up on it when repairs got too expensive. It sat on 2 acres of land near a steep ravine that led down to a creek feeding into the Cuyahoga River. The orchard I envisioned would occupy a cleared patch behind the cabin, where the soil was decent, and the sunlight was rumored to be ample. The day I arrived, the October sun filtered through the trees in long, warm beams that made the pines glow, and I felt a surge of hope. And then came the first morning. I woke to a white nothingness beyond my windows. Trees, grass, even the porch railing a few feet away were swallowed by cloud. I stepped outside to a damp chill on my cheeks, and it felt like I'd stepped into a dream or maybe a ghost story. I could barely see my own boots. That was day 1, and it became a pattern. Sunrise brought fog so dense you could lose your sense of direction if you tried to wander too far. At first, I found it peaceful. The hush of the world felt comforting after so many years of alarms and frantic voices in the ER. Even the local wildlife seemed subdued. But the more I ventured out, the more the fog unsettled me. It created illusions, shapes drifting at the corner of my vision, half-glimpsed silhouettes I couldn't quite identify. I'd spin around to look, heart lurching, only to see thick gray swirling emptily. Probably just my mind playing tricks. That's what I told myself. The cabin had no central heating, so I relied on a wood stove and a small generator for essential electricity. During the day, I cleared the backyard for my orchard, staking plots where apple, pear, and peach saplings might go. A few times, I considered hiring help to speed the process, but my gut insisted I needed solitude, that I had to handle this on my own. The orchard was my therapy, digging into soil, nurturing life. I'd kneel by the half-dug holes, ignoring the ache in my middle-aged knees, and think, this is where healing starts. On the third day, I met Park Ranger Trina Polk. She was checking the boundaries of the national park when she spotted my cabin's thin plume of smoke. I heard her footsteps on the gravel path before I saw her official uniform through the trees. She looked to be about 30, fit, and no nonsense. "Ma'am?" she called, noticing me near the orchard site. "I'm Ranger Polk. Didn't realize anyone was living out here now." I wiped my brow and introduced myself, told her I'd purchased the property, explained my orchard plans. She nodded politely, though I caught a flicker of concern when she glanced at the steep ravine. "You be careful near that drop-off," she said. "Fog here can get disorienting. We've had folks wander too close to the edges. Some end up lost, or worse." I swallowed. "I've noticed the fog already. It's thick, too thick." She eyed the orchard plots. "You're planting soon?" "That's the idea. Might take a while to get them established, though." She nodded, then paused. "Listen, if you see or hear anything strange, like footsteps in the morning that aren't yours, don't ignore it. We've had calls about odd occurrences in the ravine. People claim they see shapes or hear voices, probably the wind through the hollows, but it spooks hikers. Just letting you know." A shiver crawled up my spine. "Thank you," I said, summoning a smile. "I'll keep my ears open." She left me with a park brochure and her card in case I had any questions. Once she was gone, I looked out at the ravine, a thick green-brown tangle of trees and vines. An odd tension bloomed in my chest. Had I heard footsteps in the mornings? Sometimes, a faint crunch of gravel or leaves outside the cabin, which I blamed on deer. But now, I wondered. That night, the fog rolled in heavier than ever. I woke around midnight to a tapping sound at the window. My pulse raced. I forced myself up, grabbed a flashlight, and edged over to the glass. Outside, pure white, swirling lightly against the pane. No tapping, no figure. I flicked on the flashlight, shining it out into the void. Nothing. Then the tapping resumed, gentler but persistent. My skin prickled. I opened the window a crack, calling softly, "Hello? Anyone there?" The only answer was the shuffle of mist. With trembling hands, I shut the window, locked it, and huddled back into bed, adrenaline sizzling in my veins. Maybe a loose branch in the wind, though I hadn't seen any. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. Days turned into a week, and each morning the fog draped the valley in a ghostly blanket. I'd spend a few hours clearing land or trudging to the local feed store for supplies, then come home to that silent swirl. The orchard was taking shape, albeit slowly, but my nerves were on edge. I swore I sometimes heard footsteps around dawn, distinct footfalls crunching leaves outside the cabin. Each time I rushed to look, the fog revealed nothing. One afternoon, I decided to venture into the ravine. I wanted to see the creek, maybe gather water samples to ensure it wasn't polluted. Armed with boots, a walking stick, and a water bottle, I made my way down a narrow deer path that followed the slope. The sun was out, so the fog was minimal, just a light haze in the depths. As I descended, the temperature dropped a few degrees, the air dampening. The ravine walls towered with thick oaks, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the light to an eerie dusk. I reached the creek's edge, knelt to fill a small jar, The water looked clear, but who knew what lurked chemically? That's when I noticed a faint structure through the trees. Stone walls, half collapsed, with a peaked roof caved in at the center. An old church? My heart kicked up. Why was there a church ruin in the ravine? Curiosity overcame caution. I threaded between tree trunks, ducking vines until I stood before a crumbling building. Moss grew in thick patches over the stone, the door hanging from one hinge. It must have been small, a one-room chapel maybe. The windows were arched, shattered glass edges glinting. I stepped inside, careful not to disturb the rotting floorboards. A hush blanketed the space, the smell of wet stone and decaying wood filling my nostrils. A battered wooden altar stood at the far end, precariously leaning. Rows of rickety pews were scattered. Some collapsed. My chest tightened with an inexplicable sadness. Who built this, and why leave it to rot? I recalled Trina's mention of old voices in the ravine. Maybe this was the source of local ghost stories. I spent a few minutes poking around, half expecting a raccoon or possum to leap out. Instead, I found a weathered Bible, pages fused by water damage. As I touched it, a chill prickled my arms. Then I heard a soft sigh, like an exhalation in my ear. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across empty pews. Nothing but shadows. My heart pounded. The rational part of me said the wind had sighed through the cracks, but it felt personal. I hurried out, ignoring the creeping sense of being watched. By the time I scrambled back up to my cabin, dusk was falling. The orchard looked lonely. Rows of stakes poking from the soil. I locked the door, determined to forget the ravine church for the night. Instead, I busied myself checking the orchard plan, scribbling notes. Outside, the fog closed in again. That evening, I called Reverend Harper, the local preacher I'd briefly met in town. He'd given me his number, saying if I ever needed spiritual guidance or a friendly ear, he was available. The line crackled as I told him about the old church ruin. He paused, then said, "Ah, that place. It was abandoned decades ago after a tragedy. Some flood or fire, I'm not fully certain. Rumors claim a vengeful spirit haunts it. Superstition, perhaps, but I've heard the stories." I told him about the sigh I'd heard, the strange footsteps in the fog. He didn't laugh it off. "Sometimes places carry lingering energies," he said gently. "Might be a restless presence. If you're open to it, I'd be willing to come out, offer a blessing. Not that I think you're in grave danger, but it can't hurt to approach these matters with respect." Part of me felt silly, yet I accepted. The next day, Reverend Harper drove his old sedan up my dirt path. He was in his 60s, tall, white-haired, with a calm demeanor. We spoke briefly, then set off into the ravine. The fog was light that afternoon, allowing us to find the church without trouble. Inside, he murmured a prayer, sprinkling holy water on the dilapidated altar. As he prayed, the silence of the place deepened. My own breath sounded loud. No sudden voices, no poltergeist, just a quiet that felt watchful. When he finished, I exhaled, not sure if I felt relief or skepticism. He gave me a kind smile. Sometimes acknowledging a place's sorrow helps. I can't guarantee anything, but hopefully you'll find peace. I thanked him and walked him back out of the ravine. The orchard glowed under a fading sun, the stakes and young saplings forging a promise of future fruit. We parted ways at the cabin door. That night, for the first time in a week, I slept peacefully. No footsteps, no tapping at the window. Hope surged in me the next morning. Perhaps the blessing or prayer had eased whatever tension clung to the ravine. I flung open my door, inhaling the crisp air, smiling as sunlight burned off the last tendrils of dawn fog. Feeling emboldened, I spent the day planting my first batch of actual saplings. A few apple varieties I'd brought from a local nursery. By dusk, my back ached, but my spirit soared. But my optimism shattered that evening. Just after midnight, I bolted awake to a piercing cry. It echoed through the fog-laden night, high and mournful, like a lost soul wailing. My chest constricted with fear. Then I heard furious footsteps scraping across the porch, rattling the doorknob. I leapt out of bed, heart in my throat. The doorknob jiggled violently as though someone tried to force entry. Grabbing my flashlight, I flicked it on. The front door shook again, the wailing outside intensifying. I managed to call out, "Who's there?" My voice trembled. The rattling stopped. In the hush that followed, I caught frantic breathing, heavy, ragged. Then it retreated, footsteps crunching away into the thick, white swirl. I stood frozen for a moment, breath shaking, then lunged to lock the deadbolt. Adrenaline buzzed in my veins, every hair on my body standing upright. Morning found me exhausted, eyes gritty with lack of sleep. The orchard stood serene as ever, mocking my terror. I forced down some tea, then decided enough was enough. This land shouldn't terrorize me. I needed to face it head on. Maybe I'd try a direct approach, head to the ravine, speak aloud that I intended no harm, that I was living here peacefully. A foolish idea, possibly, but I was desperate for calm. Trina Polk showed up just as I was gearing up. She noticed my pale face, my frayed nerves. "Rough night?" she asked softly. I told her about the cry, the rattling doorknob. She sighed. "I got a call from a hiker who heard wailing near that old church. Mel, let's be honest, something's happening here. If you want, I can bring a few colleagues, but the park's resources are limited. We can't do a full investigation for ghost stories." I mustered a shaky laugh. "I understand. I think I'll go alone, though. Try to see if I can reason with whatever's out there." Her eyebrows rose. "Be careful. And if it gets bad, call me." I thanked her. Grabbing a lantern, I set off toward the ravine around twilight. Fog threatened to descend, but I pushed on, determined. The path down was steep and slick with moisture. My heart fluttered. Upon reaching the clearing near the creek, I paused, scanning for shapes. The old church loomed in the dim. I lit the lantern, stepping through the broken doorway. My footfalls echoed on damp stone. Inside, I stood by the battered altar, breath fogging in the chill air. My voice echoed softly. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm sorry for whatever happened here. I'm not here to desecrate anything. I just want to live peacefully in the cabin above. Please, let me be." My words faltered as tears surprised me. Old grief from the hospital welled up, mixing with the ravine's sorrow. "I've seen enough pain," I whispered. "I want to heal. If you're lost or hurting..." A sudden wave of cold enveloped me, sharper than the natural damp. The lantern flickered, the flame shrinking. The air felt charged, prickling my skin. My heart pounded. Then a voice, a whisper barely audible, seemed to sigh. "Help!" My entire body jolted. This was no breeze or imagination. The whisper carried a raw desperation that cut straight to my nurse's heart. "Help! How?" I croaked, shining the lantern in a frantic sweep. The gloom swallowed the light. My voice trembled with empathy. "Tell me what you need." Another faint whisper, unintelligible, then the cold receded like a tide. The lantern brightened. The hush returned. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I felt that presence fade, leaving me trembling and alone in the silent ruin. Despite my terror, a strange compassion filled me. This entity, this spirit. Did it want release, recognition? I couldn't say, but it yearned for something beyond the ravine's gloom. I left the church, stumbling back to the cabin with slow, careful steps. No wailing greeted me that night. I crawled into bed, exhausted, an ache in my soul. Over the next few days, the orchard blossomed under my steady care. Seedlings standing taller, orchard rows taking shape. The morning fog still came, but I felt less afraid. Each dawn, I'd stand on the porch, the swirling mist around me, and say quietly, "I'm here. I don't wish you harm." The tapping at the window, the rattling doorknob, the footsteps all ceased, as if the ravine's spirit recognized my sincerity. Finally, near the end of October, I gathered up my courage and returned to the ruin one last time. This time, with a small memorial plaque I'd asked a local craftsman to make. I placed it on the altar, dedicating the space to whoever once worshipped here, to any souls left behind. I lit a small candle and spoke a final prayer, not religious so much as heartfelt. The air felt gentle, almost warm. I imagined a soft presence standing beside me, grateful. I haven't heard that wailing since. The footsteps remain quiet. Ranger Trina checks on me occasionally, noting I seem calmer. Reverend Harper came by once more, smiling at the orchard's progress. The orchard thrives in a way that feels almost blessed, the saplings pushing green leaves despite the onset of cooler weather. Each sunrise, the fog blankets the valley, but it seems friendlier, shimmering with the pink light of dawn. Sometimes I think I glimpse a figure among the trees at the ravine's edge, but there's no fear, just a passing shadow in the mist. Each day I tend the orchard, remembering the hospital corridor lights that used to blind me. I breathe in the earthy scent of fresh soil, letting it ground me. The cabin, once an empty retreat, has become a home. The ravine no longer looms with menace but hums with quiet acceptance. People ask if I regret leaving nursing behind. I tell them I'm still caring for life, these saplings, this land, maybe in a different way, but still with compassion. At dusk, I sometimes sit on the porch, sipping tea as the fog creeps in. Instead of dread, I feel a calm reverence, as though I share the night with an old friend. The orchard stands behind me, each small tree a testament to renewal. Below, the ravine cradles the ruins of that abandoned church, a place that once harbored sorrow. Now, I like to believe it holds peace. A part of me suspects the spirit or spirits that lurked might remain, watching over the valley in the hush of foggy mornings. But they've found no reason to haunt me. We coexist, bound by empathy and the simple act of acknowledgement. In that quiet acceptance, I've found my own healing, beyond the clamor of hospital walls, beyond the heartbreak that drove me here. And in the gentle swirl of mist each dawn, I sense a new beginning, for me, and perhaps for the ravine's lonely ghosts, drifting toward rest in the embrace of the Cuyahoga's ever-present hush. I arrived at the bluff on a stormy afternoon, the wind whipping whitecaps on Lake Erie as dark clouds piled on the horizon. My ancient hatchback groaned on the gravel road, loaded with half my belongings in crumpled cardboard boxes. When I finally got out, the gale nearly knocked me sideways, salt spray misting the air even though the water was a good 100 feet below. I pulled my coat tight, a tingle of exhilaration dancing up my spine. This was it, my new home, a yurt perched on a cliff above the lake, overshadowed by the brooding Ohio sky. The perfect spot to paint, I told myself, ignoring the pulse of nerves that warned me I might be in over my head. I'd found the yurt listing online, a cheap off-grid rental near Geneva on the lake. Seemed too good to be true. Scenic views, a local fisherman's cove, a chance to capture Lake Erie's dramatic moods with my watercolors. I'd been drifting the past few years, traveling from place to place, but never settling. Something about the phrase wild, untamed shoreline had spoken to me. Plus, the cost was minimal, and the promise of solitude appealed to my artistic side. So I'd thrown caution to the wind and driven here with the last of my savings. Now, as I stood by the car, the wind slammed the yurt's canvas walls with a heavy flap. The structure was round, maybe 15 feet in diameter, perched on a small wooden platform hammered into the rocky bluff. The solar panel array, a modest collection of battered panels on a makeshift stand, tilted precariously toward the gray sky. A single wind turbine squeaked on its pole nearby. The tall grasses around the site bent in the gale, revealing the sandy soil beneath. "Okay, Robin," I muttered, bracing against another gust. "You said you wanted drama for your paintings. Well, you got it." I started unloading boxes, carting them up the rickety steps to the yurt's entrance flap. My gear included a cheap generator, a trunk of art supplies, a cooler with basic groceries, and my sleeping bag. By the time I wrestled the last box inside, my cheeks were numb from the wind's bite. I latched the yurt door flap behind me, grateful for even this thin canvas barrier. The interior was Spartan: a low cot, a small wood stove for heat, a single shelf, and a battery system rigged to the solar panels. A second door flap led to a tiny nook that functioned as a kitchen area, with a sink and a drain that presumably emptied off the bluff. I half laughed, half shivered at how quickly I'd gone from living in cheap motels to living in a glorified tent. I told myself, this is all for the sake of painting. Lake Erie's storms, sunsets, moody dawns. I'd been searching for a place that resonated with me, hoping to break my creative slump. If this didn't spark my muse, what would? That first night, I realized how harsh the windstorms could be. The canvas walls flexed under each gust, the metal supports groaning ominously. Rain lashed the roof, a wild staccato that felt borderline terrifying. At one point, around midnight, I heard a whistling keen that seemed to circle the yurt, weaving in and out of the wind's roar. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, telling myself it was just the gale cutting across the bluff. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, but I dreamt of a voice in that wind, calling softly across dark waters. Morning came with a weak sun filtering through the canvas, revealing Lake Erie in all its restless glory. The storm had left behind steel-gray water, rolling swells that battered the rocks below my perch. I brewed coffee on my propane stove, stepping outside to sip it, letting the brisk air wake me fully. And that's when I noticed the orbs, a cluster of faint lights flickering near the water's surface, far out in the lake, like tiny dancing lanterns. I blinked, thinking it was my groggy vision playing tricks. But the lights persisted, bobbing gently before winking out. I told myself it must be sunlight reflecting off waves, but the sky was overcast, and the reflection theory didn't hold. Pushing the odd sight aside, I set up my easel, determined to capture the morning's colors: ashen sky, dark teal water, the jagged line of the horizon. My brush strokes felt shaky, my mind still lingering on the orbs. Eventually, I gave up, resolving to try again after lunch. Instead, I decided to drive to the nearest grocery for supplies, hoping the short trip would clear my head. That's how I met Marvin Wolfe. Pulling into a small convenience store near the marina, I noticed an older man with sun-scorched skin and a lined face, sitting on a bench out front. He wore a thick fisherman's sweater and scuffed boots. Our eyes met as I walked up, and he gave a curt nod. "Morning," I offered, awkward but friendly. He grunted, then eyed my battered car. "New in town?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'm renting the yurt up on the bluffs." His gaze sharpened. "Heard about that place? Wind can knock you off your feet up there. You careful." I mustered a smile. "Thanks. I'll watch the wind." He hesitated. "You paint or something? You got that look about you." I laughed, surprised. "I'm a watercolor artist, yeah, hoping to capture the lake's moods, like the storms and sunsets." He snorted softly. "Lake's got more moods than you can handle, I bet, especially at night." His eyes took on a distant cast. "Some folks see lights on the water, strange calls echoing across the waves. Might want to keep watch." My stomach flipped. I saw something like that this morning, actually. Flickering lights out there. I tried to sound casual. Any idea what they are? He shrugged, mouth pulling thin. Legend says a banshee or spirit roams the lake. Some say it calls folks to their doom, lures 'em in. But maybe it's just gas from rotting fish or reflections, right? His tone made it clear he didn't entirely believe the rational explanation. I thanked him for the warning, grabbed my groceries, and left, a new tension settling in my shoulders. Returning to the yurt, I couldn't shake the sense that Lake Erie was more than a simple subject to be painted. Something roiled beneath its surface, a restlessness that matched my own creative turmoil. That night, as the wind picked up again, I stepped out to observe the dark water, heart pounding at the possibility of seeing those lights again. Sure enough, around 10 p.m., faint orbs danced near the horizon, drifting closer, then vanishing. I squinted, hands trembling. That was no reflection. And, in the wind, I heard an eerie cry, something between a gull's screech and a wail. My hair stood on end. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape gliding over the water, pale and elongated, but the darkness swallowed it. Fear prickled my scalp. Who in their right mind would be out there at this hour? Unable to sleep, I rummaged the internet for Lake Erie folklore. Tales of ghost ships, drowned souls, rumored lake monsters. But one story recurred in local legends. A spirit or banshee that haunted certain coves, crying out on stormy nights, leading unsuspecting victims to a watery grave. I shook my head at the sensationalism, but couldn't deny the goosebumps creeping over my skin. The next day, I met Alicia Sawyer, a coastal conservationist working on shoreline cleanups. She arrived in a battered SUV, fresh from collecting debris along the beaches. I was in the middle of reorganizing my disheveled yurt when she knocked on the wooden platform. She had short-cropped hair, a determined gaze, and a handshake that felt surprisingly strong. "Robin, right?" she asked. "I do volunteer work around the lake. Heard from the store clerk you were living up here. Thought I'd say hi, see if you want to help with beach cleanups." I agreed, happy for a chance at human contact and an excuse to talk about the weird lights. As we walked along the bluff's edge, picking up stray plastic bits lodged in the grass, I mentioned the orbs. Alicia pursed her lips, looking out over the endless water. "You're not the first to see them," she said quietly. "I've heard stories from anglers, late-night campers. Some say it's a phenomenon of temperature inversions. Others swear it's a supernatural presence. They call it the Lady of the Lake, or a banshee." She paused, locking eyes with me. "I'm not superstitious, but I respect local myths. The lake's claimed many lives over the years. Sometimes folks say the drowned ones roam the waves." A shudder passed through me. "So you think it's ghosts?" She shrugged. "Or natural illusions. Hard to say. But be careful around the cliffs at night. The wind can push you if you're not paying attention." That night, I tried to do a painting by moonlight, wanting to capture the eerie silhouette of the lake under the stars. My lantern cast an orange glow, and the rising moon tinted the water silver. I sat near the yurt's edge, brush in hand, eyes flicking between canvas and horizon. Then, at midnight, the orbs emerged again, closer than before, dancing, swirling. My brush froze. Gooseflesh prickled my arms. I realized with a jolt that the lights were drifting in my direction, like they'd noticed me. The wind rose, howling around the yurt. The orbs glided closer, maybe a few hundred yards offshore, swirling like a ghostly ballet. My pulse hammered. Then, faint at first, I heard a call. A wail so plaintive it made my eyes sting. The brush slipped from my hand. The call grew louder, almost forming a wordless song of sorrow. I couldn't breathe, transfixed by a longing so deep I wanted to weep. Suddenly, it clicked. A lure. the stories about a banshee or spirit that enticed souls into the lake. My rational mind screamed at me to move, to get inside, but my body traitorously leaned forward as if enchanted. The lights twirled in mesmerizing patterns. My heart thundered in my chest. Another wave of that mournful cry washed over me, and I found myself rising, stepping toward the cliff's edge. Some part of me realized how insane this was, but the sorrowful pull felt so real, like a magnet tugging at my soul. Another step. A gust of wind battered me, and I wobbled, fear snapping me partially out of the trance. "No," I gasped, wrenching my gaze away from the lights. My body trembled, adrenaline flooding in. I forced myself to shuffle back toward the yurt, refusing to look at the water. The wind shrieked again, almost mocking me. Inside, I collapsed onto my cot, heart pounding, sweat chilling my skin. That had been too close. Had I seriously almost walked off the cliff? Could some ephemeral spirit manipulate me like that? I lay awake until dawn, mind racing. In the morning, I found fish carcasses arranged near the yurt's steps, mangled, half-eaten, placed in a neat circle. My stomach lurched. Raccoons or gulls might do that, but a perfect circle? The sense of menace was undeniable. Enough was enough. I called Marvin Wolf, stammering about the lights luring me. He listened solemnly, then advised me to set a strong lantern facing the water at night, as a sign I wasn't to be messed with. "Carry a piece of iron," he added cryptically. "Old wives' tale, but can't hurt." I also phoned Alicia. She arrived by midday, scanning the fish circle with unsettled eyes. "This is odd," she murmured. "You sure some animal didn't do this?" I could only shrug helplessly. Do animals place carcasses in a perfect ring? We decided to hold a nighttime watch, the two of us together, to see if we could gather proof of whatever approached. I set up my generator lantern, shining out over the cliff, scattering bright beams across the lake. Alicia brought a camera with a decent zoom. We stayed up, sipping strong coffee, nerves taut. Around midnight, the orbs appeared, swirling beyond the beam's reach. Alicia started recording. Then came the wail again, low and mournful, weaving through the wind. The hair on my neck stood up. Alicia's camera trembled in her hands. The lights inched closer, flickering in and out of existence. My throat constricted as that sorrowful call vibrated in my skull, a beckoning that made my chest ache. Alicia let out a soft gasp. "I see. Something." She lifted the camera to her eye. "Robin, it's like a figure moving. Oh God, it's so faint." I mustered courage, shining my lantern beam toward the lights. They recoiled slightly, swirling in agitation. The cry rose in pitch, heartbreak incarnate. My eyes stung with tears, the hopelessness of that sound seeping into my bones. Alicia staggered back, almost dropping the camera. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to walk forward. Suddenly, a large wave swelled below the bluff, crashing against the rocks with a thunderous boom. The lights jerked upward, then blinked out, leaving only the wail echoing for a moment more before fading into the gale. We stood there panting, adrenaline racing. Alicia's hands trembled as she lowered the camera. I got something on video, but it's mostly lights and weird audio." I collapsed into a folding chair, tears sliding down my cheeks. "What does it want?" I whispered, hugging my arms. "It's like it's lonely, or hungry." Alicia crouched beside me, voice shaky. "Whatever it is, it's dangerous. You almost fell. We need to figure out how to break this hold." We researched local lore the next day, scouring library archives in the nearest town. We found references to old shipwrecks, drownings near the bluffs. One story mentioned a woman who'd leapt off the cliff in despair centuries ago, rumored to roam the waves seeking company. Another tale described a monstrous spirit that devoured unsuspecting fishermen. hard to separate rumor from truth, but a recurring theme emerged, leaving an offering or bright light to repel the lake banshee. So we decided on a final stand. Alicia and I set up the brightest lights we had, shining them out to sea like beacons. We placed a symbolic offering near the cliff, fresh flowers, a small painting I'd made of a peaceful lake scene, and a simple note that read, "We honor your pain. We won't follow you into the depths. Rest in peace." It felt corny, but maybe it was the best we could do. When night fell, a monstrous storm loomed. Lightning forked the sky, and the wind whipped around our yurt in fury. We braced ourselves outside, wearing ponchos, gripping the lights. The orbs appeared again, swirling more violently than ever. The cry tore through the thunder, an anguished wail that made my knees weak. The lights advanced, flickering, demanding. I felt the pull in my gut, that dreadful longing. Alicia's teeth chattered from fear or cold or both, but our floodlights glared across the water, fighting the darkness. The offering on the ground flapped in the wind. I clung to Alicia's arm, anchoring us. Another flash of lightning illuminated the wave-lashed shore. The orbs convulsed, dancing into a ragged spiral. I forced my voice to steady. "We see your sorrow. We can't follow. Rest." My words vanished into the roaring wind. For a breathless moment, it seemed the orbs would press forward. Then the loudest thunderclap I've ever heard cracked overhead, shaking the earth. The orbs flickered wildly. The banshee's wail climaxed in a piercing shriek, and then silence. The lights winked out. The cry choked off mid-note, leaving only the storm's howling. My lungs squeezed. Did we succeed? All at once, the wind lessened, the rain slackening. We lowered our lights, hearts hammering. The lake churned, but no orbs glowed. No sorrowful moan drifted from the waves. After minutes of tense waiting, Alicia let out a ragged breath. "I think it's gone," she whispered, voice shaking with relief. Dawn revealed a calm, glassy lake. The battered yurt had survived another storm. My offering lay drenched near the cliff, the flowers wilted. But something felt lifted, as if the lake breathed easier. I ventured to the edge, peering down at the turquoise waters swirling below. No swirling lights, no tug on my soul, just the breeze in my hair, salt laced from the lake's brine. In the weeks that followed, no more orbs danced, no fish carcasses appeared in odd circles, no wailing echo tore through the wind. Alicia checked in, showing me the blurry footage on her camera. Even though the lights were faint, the audio captured that unearthly moan. Chills skittered over me as I listened, but a sense of closure lingered. We'd faced it and survived. I stayed on the bluff, finishing my orchard of seascape paintings. The environment grew gentler, or maybe it was just me finding peace. Marvin stopped by once, nodding at the bright orchard I'd sown around the yurt. He asked if the lights still came, and I shook my head. He gave a half smile, saying only, "Guess the lake's quiet now." Sometimes, at dusk, I stand by the cliffs listening to the waves. The wind still roars, but it carries no anguished cry. Instead, I hear the rhythmic hush of water meeting stone, a lullaby rather than a summons. My paintings reflect a calmer palette, soft indigos, warm golds. Maybe the spirit found rest. Maybe my silly offering and stubborn floodlights parted the veil between sorrow and release. Or maybe the storms just shifted. All I know is, Lake Erie no longer tries to lure me into its depths. I remain here in my yurt, bracing against the wind but unafraid. The waves keep their secrets, and I keep painting them, capturing the stormy horizon but also the tranquil calm after the squall. In that interplay, I find a reflection of my own journey, dark nights of the soul giving way to a dawn that promises another day, another canvas, another story of survival. Whatever lurked in the water has receded into memory, leaving me with the lake's raw, beautiful mood to explore, free from the banshee's haunting cry. I first laid eyes on the old log house at twilight, the sky bleeding orange over the dense trees of Wayne National Forest. I remember cutting the engine in a cloud of gravel dust and stepping out into a hush that made my heart thud a bit harder. All around me, the tall pines rose like silent sentinels, and the house, my new home, sat in a small clearing off an overgrown stagecoach trail. I could almost see the ghosts of wagons long gone. The sign I'd passed a few miles back read, Shawnee Stagecoach Route, Esterns 1800s, which had been half swallowed by weeds. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or the encroaching night, but the place already felt haunted by history. I'd come here for that very history. I'm a self-confessed frontier lore buff, and after spending years buried in library archives, I finally decided to immerse myself in the real thing. Rather than read about old roads or stare at microfiche reels, I wanted to live in the thick of it. My plan was simple. Restore the crumbling log house, investigate local legends about highwaymen and stagecoach robberies, and record it all for a possible book. Romantic, sure, but everyone's got to have a calling. Mine just happened to involve dust, mosquitoes, and possibly ghosts. The log house was older than anything I'd lived in before. Its porch sagged, the windows were clouded, and the roof was patched with mismatched shingles. A hand dug well out back promised the basics. Water, if I kept the pump working. I had a small wood stove for heat, no electricity unless I rigged a generator, and a battered phone that lost service the moment I left a paved road. Still, that was the charm of it. A simpler life, a chance to step back in time on this historic stagecoach route. Or so I'd told myself, ignoring the sense of isolation that now settled like a weight in my gut. My first week passed in a blur of chores. I hammered boards over gaps in the walls, cleared a safe path to the well, and set up a lantern system inside. At night, the forest breathed around me, full of cicadas, owls, and the occasional rustle that left me clutching my flashlight. The wind in the pines sometimes sounded like whispers. Imagination, I assured myself, though goose flesh often prickled my arms. One afternoon, storm clouds rolled in, bringing a fierce downpour that left me stranded inside, watching the sky flicker with lightning while rain pounded the logs. When I finally stepped out after the storm, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. Wagon wheel tracks, fresh in the muddy trail leading right past my house. Perfect arcs cut into the soggy earth, disappearing into the trees. My heart lurched. That trail had barely seen a human foot in years, let alone a horse-drawn wagon. I knelt, running my fingers over the grooves. They were crisp, like they'd been made minutes ago, but nobody was in sight. The hair on my neck stood up. Just leftover grooves from old erosion, I told myself, though the rational part of me said that was nonsense. Old grooves might be faint, but these were newly pressed. I shivered and retreated inside, locking the door. Realization hit me. I was spooked. On day one, I'd been enamored with the history. Now, it felt like the past had come knocking in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my routine. I spent mornings venturing deeper into Wayne National Forest, taking notes on any remnants of the stagecoach route, broken signposts, collapsed inns, old mile markers. I snapped photos, planning to compile them later. I discovered a broken stone foundation near a creek, presumably where travelers once watered horses. My historian's heart soared at such finds, but always in the back of my mind lurked that memory of the wagon tracks. I wanted to see them again, confirm I wasn't losing my mind, but they never reappeared. until the night I heard hoofbeats. It was close to midnight, the moon lost behind clouds. I was drifting off on my cot in the main room, the wood stove's embers casting flickers on the walls. Then, faint but distinct, came the echo of horses trotting. My eyes snapped open, heart jumping to my throat. The sound grew louder, a steady clip-clop. There was no question this time. It was right outside, passing along the trail. Adrenaline surged. I grabbed my flashlight, stumbling to the window. Darkness greeted me. The hoofbeats receded into the distance, yet I saw no figures, no silhouette of a horse or rider, just the empty trail under a waning moon. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By dawn, I found new hoofprints in the mud, leading the same path as the wagon tracks. Anxiety tangled in my stomach. I'd expected local folklore to revolve around stagecoach robberies, violent highwaymen, or unfortunate travelers, but this felt too immediate. I needed an outside perspective. That's when I decided to call Becca Marsh. We'd corresponded online a few times, bonding over our love of obscure ghost stories. She was a traveling blogger who documented haunted or forgotten places. When I told her about my new place, she'd offered to come check it out if I found anything juicy. Well, I had. The next day, she arrived in her dusty sedan, stepping out with a wide grin that quickly faded when she saw my tense expression. "Elias," she said, hugging me, "you look like you've seen a ghost." I huffed a nervous laugh. "That might not be far off. Come in, I'll explain." Over coffee. Instant, since I lacked modern luxuries. I showed her the photos of the wagon tracks and recounted the mysterious hoofbeats. She didn't bat an eye, leaning forward eagerly. "This is prime ghost story material," she said, rummaging in her bag for a small audio recorder. "Stagecoach roads are rife with legends. People used to get robbed and killed out here, right?" I nodded. "The territory was dangerous in the 1800s. I read about bandits who ambushed travelers. Some folks rumored entire coaches vanished on the route, the passengers never found." Her eyes gleamed. "Sounds like you might have leftover echoes of that. Or maybe actual restless spirits, reenacting their final journeys. This is so good for my blog." Then she softened. "But also kind of terrifying for you. Let's see if we can capture any evidence. Sometimes EVPs pick up phantom sounds." I'll admit, I was relieved to have her company, if only so I didn't face phantom wagons alone. That evening, we set up a couple of small recorders near the trail, plus a motion-activated camera. The sky turned violet as night fell, the forest quieting in anticipation. The tension in my chest mounted. We huddled on the porch, sipping tea, scanning the shadows with our flashlights. Close to midnight, the hush broke. At first, a mere whisper of metal squeaking, then the distinct rattle of wooden wheels. My pulse pounded. Becca's eyes widened as she nudged me. We stood, stepping off the porch. The motion camera's red light blinked, indicating it was recording. The rattling grew louder. Then the unmistakable clop of horses. My heart hammered in my ears. In the gloom, we saw nothing but the wavering outline of trees. Yet the sounds were so vivid, it was as though a stagecoach was barreling right past us. We pressed ourselves to the side of the trail, adrenaline coursing. The rattle, the hoof beats, a faint jingle of harness, and then a muffled scream, abrupt, agonized. Becca clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes brimming with fear. Another scream echoed. Then the noise faded, as if the coach vanished around a bend. We stood in stunned silence, the crickets filling the void left by the phantom coach. My knees felt weak. This was no ordinary haunting. People might talk of residual energy, but that scream, that was raw despair. Becca scrambled to check the recorder. Her hands shook. We retreated inside, locking the door, hearts pounding. In the lamplight, we listened. Sure enough, The audio picked up the distant creak of wheels, the hoofbeats, the screams. The hair on my neck prickled as we replayed it. Becca whispered, "It's like they're reliving their final moments. The victims of an ambush, maybe." I swallowed. I found references to a stagecoach robbery in 1823, where the bandits killed everyone aboard. Bodies apparently tossed in the forest. No official record of punishment for the criminals. She nodded gravely. If that's what we're dealing with, maybe we can give them closure. Spirits replaying their doom are often stuck. We could research exactly who died and see if we can do something to acknowledge them. The next morning, we took the recorder to Sheriff Fowler's small office in the nearest town. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, known for being pragmatic. Some might say dismissive of spooky tales. He listened politely, though I saw skepticism behind his gaze. "Look," he said, "I won't say you're faking it, but there's lots of ways audio can pick up weird echoes. I doubt dead travelers are riding ghost coaches on your trail." I argued that the tracks were real, the hoof prints too. Fowler shrugged. Could be local kids pulling pranks. Could be stray horses. If folks vanish up there, let me know, but I can't spend department resources on ghost hunts. He gave Becca and me a pointed look, like he was humoring us. We left, feeling deflated. "Figures," Becca muttered. "He'll only believe if someone disappears." Her eyes sparked. "I guess we'll do our own digging. We'll solve it ourselves." We dove into local archives at the library, rifling through old newspapers, diaries, land deeds. Eventually, we found a battered volume detailing a stagecoach robbery around 1823. 3 passengers and a driver were reportedly killed, their valuables stolen. The culprits were rumored to be highwaymen who vanished without a trace. Some folks claimed the travelers never received proper burial, and the bodies were left to rot near the trail. No wonder their spirits might be stuck, reenacting that final ride. By the time we finished, dusk was settling again. We rushed back to my log house, spurred by a plan. If these were indeed the spirits of those murdered travelers, maybe we could set up a simple memorial, like a marker acknowledging their names. We'd found 2 partial names in the records, a Mr. Phillips and a driver Johnson. The others were listed as unidentified passengers. The account was sparse, but it was something. That night, we hammered together a makeshift wooden cross. We burned the names we knew into it and wrote unknown souls for the rest. Then, armed with the cross, a couple of candles, and shaky resolve, we headed to the trail. The moon was half full, illuminating the forest in ghostly silver. My stomach churned. We stuck the cross into a patch of soft ground near where we'd heard the coach pass, then lit the candles. The air felt charged, as though a storm approached, but the sky was clear. Midnight struck. The forest hush grew oppressive, the insects falling silent. Then came the familiar rattle of wheels. I braced myself, lantern in hand. Hoofbeats followed, echoing like distant thunder. My heart thundered, but we stood firm. The sounds approached, invisible yet so tangible. A phantom shape seemed to pass along the trail, a swirl of swirling darkness. I glimpsed a flicker of lamplight as though a carriage lantern glowed. Shadows on shadows, a driver hunched at the reins. We raised the lanterns and the cross, my voice trembling as I said, "We know you were wronged. We remember your tragedy. May you find rest." I forced myself to stand in the path. If these spirits replayed the same route, maybe we could break the loop. My pulse roared in my ears as the phantom coach bore down, the horses' snorts harsh. Then a scream tore through the night, pure agony. I nearly dropped the cross. The swirling darkness enveloped us, a cold wave that rattled my bones. Wind howled. Or maybe it was the ghosts moaning in unison. My eyes teared up from the force of their sorrow. Beside me, Becca shouted, "We're sorry you were abandoned. We acknowledge your pain. You're free to go." Or we repeated phrases like that, words we hoped could grant peace. The darkness churned around us, the hoofbeats surging. Fear threatened to shatter my courage, but I held the cross high, praying that sincerity was enough. Suddenly, the noise crescendoed. The screams, the clatter, the hoofbeats all melding into a cacophony. Then, silence. The wind died. The swirling darkness ebbed. Our lantern light revealed only the empty trail, the cross jammed in the earth, candles flickering weakly. My breath came in ragged gasps. It was as if the entire scene had lifted like a weight. Becca's eyes shone with tears, her shoulders trembling. We waited, hearts pounding, but no new screams came, no hoofbeats. The forest slowly returned to its normal night murmurs. Crickets, rustling leaves, an owl hooting far off. We shared a look of stunned relief. Gently, we set the cross deeper, tamping the soil around it. A makeshift memorial, yes, but we hoped it'd serve as a final resting marker for those lost souls from 1823. The next morning, in the bright dawn, we walked the trail. No fresh wagon tracks marred the mud. The ground looked undisturbed, save for our footprints. Over the following weeks, I kept a wary ear out at night, but no phantom stagecoach rattled by. No screams shattered my sleep. Even the sheriff, Fowler, eventually wandered up to see if things had settled down. We told him we'd had no more incidents, though we spared him the details of our midnight vigil. He'd likely chalk it up to nonsense. Becca wrote a piece for her blog, Haunted Highwaymen of the Shawnee Trail, describing our encounters without sensationalizing too much. It caught some interest, but she refused to disclose the exact location of my log house, wanting to preserve the peace. The haunted rumor might persist, but I suspect the spirits found release. I stay on, continuing my simple life in the log house, documenting the old stagecoach route's history for my own project. I gather accounts from older locals about bandits and lost caravans, compile old newspaper clippings. The nights are calm, the forest's hush comforting rather than ominous. Sometimes, while fetching water from the well at dusk, I glance at the trail, half expecting to hear the faint rattle of wheels, but it remains still, touched only by the breeze. Every so often, I place fresh flowers at the cross we erected, acknowledging those travelers I never met but whose tragedy I'd helped ease. If ghosts do linger, they seem content now, no longer bound to replay that horrid final journey. Maybe that's all they needed, a simple act of empathy, a marker acknowledging their suffering. Maybe that's all any spirit needs. As for me, I've found the quiet I craved. The log house feels like home, no longer a looming relic. The nights bring gentle rustles of wildlife, a far cry from the old terror of phantom hoofbeats. I suppose one can say I exorcised the trail's ghosts through compassion, though I prefer to think I simply gave them the respect they'd been denied for centuries. Even so, I'll never forget that moment in the moonlit night when I stood on the haunted stagecoach route, facing the roar of a doomed carriage. The raw pain in those screams reminded me how the past can cling to a place, craving remembrance. I learned that when we listen, when we honor the forgotten, we can free both them and ourselves from old chains. Now, I wake to birdsong, brew my coffee over a small propane burner, and step onto the porch. The forest bathed in morning light. The stagecoach route waits in the distance, a piece of history and memory entwined. I smile, whisper a quiet greeting to any lingering souls, and move on with my day, gathering lumber, writing my notes. Life continues, and I can't help but feel a gentle presence blessing the trail, no longer haunted, but held in a peaceful hush. I arrived at the Amish country property one soft August afternoon. the sun just beginning its lazy descent behind the rolling hills near Millersburg. The dirt road leading up to my new farm was little more than 2 tire tracks weaving between fields of corn and soy, a sea of green under the hazy Ohio sky. I'd driven from the city for hours, my car stuffed with clothes, basic supplies, and a scattering of midwifery textbooks I couldn't bear to part with. Leaving nursing behind was never an easy choice, but after years of burnout, I yearned for a slower life, something off-grid, self-sufficient, away from the relentless hum of hospital corridors. When I finally pulled up to the farmhouse, it looked older than the online photos had let on. A small, off-white structure with an uneven roof and chipped paint. But I loved how it nestled against a woodlot, the fields stretching out behind like a promise of new beginnings. The main source of power would be a small solar array I'd borrowed from a friend, combined with a few oil lamps for the evenings. Water came from an ancient well out back, if I could keep it primed. Not exactly comfortable, but that was the point. I needed to reset my life, strip away the modern noise. As I hauled my boxes to the porch, I noticed the silence. Sure, there were crickets and a distant whir of cicadas, but compared to the city, it was almost eerie. The closest neighbors were Amish families scattered across the region, known for living with minimal tech. I'd read about their gentle presence, how some outsiders found them aloof. I hoped they wouldn't mind a newcomer in their midst. I spent the afternoon cleaning dust from the kitchen counters, testing the old pump. It sputtered but worked, and sweeping spiders out of corners. By dusk, I'd collapsed onto a creaky rocking chair on the porch, letting the mild summer breeze soothe my tired mind. Fireflies danced along the edge of the fields, and for the first time in months, a small sense of peace bubbled in my chest. Maybe this was right. Maybe I could find solace here, reorient my life around simpler tasks, growing vegetables, caring for goats, maybe even making cheese to sell at the local market. No more hospital beeps and tragic nights. That night, sleep found me easily, until around midnight, when a distant cry snapped me awake. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound was faint, like a baby's whimper echoing through the farmland. I listened, breath hitching, but it didn't repeat. After minutes of tense silence, I convinced myself it was an owl or a stray cat. I drifted back to sleep, half uneasy. Come morning, the sun glistened on dew-soaked grass. I rose early, determined to explore the property. Behind the house, a small barn and a chicken coop stood in disrepair, begging for fresh paint and new siding. But I saw potential. I pictured goats in a fenced pen, a row of vegetables behind the barn. The Amish families around might trade produce, share knowledge. If I could befriend them, maybe I'd glean tips for living off-grid more comfortably. Around noon, I hopped into my car to find groceries in Millersburg. On the way back, I nearly passed a buggy clip-clopping along the road. I slowed, giving the horse and driver space. He wore traditional Amish clothing, straw hat, humble posture. I waved politely. He tipped his hat in acknowledgement. As I continued on, I wondered about bridging these two worlds, my city background and their simpler ways. That evening, I found a battered cradle in the barn, shoved in a dusty corner among broken tools and musty hay bales. My curiosity flared. The cradle was wooden, carved with a simple floral pattern along the edges, worn smooth by time. It looked old, definitely handmade. Something about it tugged at my midwife's heart. Why was it left behind? I brushed away cobwebs, noticing the rockers still worked, though squeaking. An eerie sensation prickled my arms. A cradle in an abandoned barn out here in Amish country? I carried it inside, intending to clean it up. Maybe I'd repurpose it for storing blankets or something. But as I set it down in my living room, a wave of cold dread swept over me. So sudden it made me gasp. The air in the house felt heavier. I laughed nervously, blaming the exhaustion. That night, I woke again around midnight. A soft cry drifting through the darkness. A baby's sob, heartbreakingly weak. My pulse skyrocketed. I threw aside the covers, heart thudding as I groped for my lantern. The crying persisted, echoing faintly from the living room. Terror and maternal instinct clashed in my chest. Stepping into the living room, lantern held high, I found it empty. The cradle sat by the wall, untouched. The crying faded to a whisper, then vanished. I approached the cradle, breath shaking, knuckles white on the lantern handle. Nothing but worn wood and shadows. Was I dreaming? When morning light arrived, I shook off the incident as a product of my imagination. The old cradle must have stirred memories of my midwife days, my longing to help newborns. Yet the day felt off. The pump required more coaxing than usual, and a swirl of gnats plagued me as I weeded a patch of ground for a garden. By afternoon, I decided to ask my nearest Amish neighbor, Jacob Robber, if he knew anything about the property's history. Jacob welcomed me politely at his neat farmstead a mile away, offering a cup of lemonade. He had kind eyes, though his demeanor was reserved. I asked about my land, the old barn, the cradle. He frowned. I recall talk that a young Amish woman once lived there, long ago before she left the community. She was troubled. Some say her baby died. Others say the baby vanished. He lowered his gaze. It's not spoken of much. A chill crept up my spine. Do you know the details? He shook his head. Only that sorrow hung over the place. Folks avoided it. I was a boy then. If that cradle was hers, perhaps it's best to leave it be. That evening, I stared at the cradle with new unease. If a tragedy occurred here, did it linger like a shadow? My rational mind told me not to feed into superstition, but my midwife heart whispered that unresolved grief could leave a spiritual imprint. At midnight, the baby's cry returned. This time, it was louder, echoing from the living room with heartbreaking clarity. I bolted upright, mind reeling. My lantern wobbled in my grip as I rushed out. The cradle rocked gently, squeaking in the gloom. My breath caught, eyes locked on the cradle's slow motion. Then the crying ceased. Everything stilled except my trembling. In the morning, I drove into town, seeking any record of a mother and missing baby. The local library's archivist, a patient woman named Leah, helped me sift through old newspapers, property deeds, church records. After hours, we found a small mention from decades ago. Local Amish woman Sarah Yoder left her community after her infant's unexplained death. Coroner's notes unclear. My chest tightened. The baby had died? If so, had the woman fled in grief or shame? And what about the cradle? That day, while clearing more brush around the barn, I felt watched. Every time the wind sighed through the oaks, I tensed. The caretaker in me demanded I help somehow. This baby's restless spirit, or the mother's sorrow, must be tied to that cradle. I decided to hold a simple blessing or ceremony, acknowledging the child's memory. I prepared by cleaning the cradle thoroughly, wiping away decades of dust, mending a splintered rocker with careful hands. Then I placed a soft cloth inside, a small bouquet of wildflowers. That night, as dusk cloaked the fields, I lit a single candle, setting it by the cradle. My voice trembled as I said, "Little one, whoever you are, I'm sorry. If you need rest, you have it. I'm not here to replace you, but to honor you." My words felt foolish, but I poured all my compassion into them. For a moment, warmth seemed to spread in the room, as if the air sighed in relief. I exhaled, relieved. But hours later, the crying returned, this time accompanied by a strange knocking on the windows. My heart pounded as I realized something more malevolent might be at play. The cradle rocked violently on its own, the squeak turning frantic. I stood there paralyzed, candlelight casting wild shadows. A final shriek tore through the house, a mixture of a baby's wail and a woman's sob. Then the cradle went still. My tears flowed unbidden. This was more than a lonely ghost. It felt like raw anguish, twisted by decades of pain. Desperate for guidance, I spoke to Joanna Pierce, a friend from the city who visited on weekends. She listened to my story, wide-eyed but supportive. Could it be a curse placed on the cradle? She asked. If the mother's grief or bitterness was strong enough, like an energy imprint, we hypothesized that the baby's death, combined with the mother's heartbreak, might have tainted the cradle with a dark sorrow. If so, acknowledging it wasn't enough. We needed a more direct ritual, maybe burying or burning the cradle. My heart sank at the thought of destroying it, but the oppressive atmosphere grew day by day, draining my energy and overshadowing any peace I found here. One afternoon, Jacob dropped by with some fresh produce. He noticed my haunted expression, asking if I was unwell. Hesitantly, I told him about the cradle's nightly cries, leaving out the more dramatic details. He paled. I heard rumors that cradle was cursed, he said grimly. People claimed to hear a baby crying at night, so they locked it away in the barn. Maybe it's time to set it free. That sealed it. We decided on a small bonfire near the orchard behind the farmhouse, far from the barn. Joanna, who stayed the weekend, helped gather kindling. At dusk, we carried the cradle out, every step feeling heavier. My heart ached, as though I were betraying an innocent infant's memory. But the oppressive dread in the house had grown unbearable. We lit the fire under a sky streaked with gold and pink. The flames crackled, casting long shadows across the grass. I hugged the cradle one last time, whispering an apology. Sorry for your pain. Sorry for this end. Then I set it onto the fire, flames licking up the curved rockers, the old carved patterns. Almost immediately, a keening wail erupted, swirling around us as if the wind carried a child's final cry. Joanna gasped, covering her mouth. Jacob's shoulders tensed, face drawn in sympathy. My eyes stung with tears. The wail built to a crescendo, the cradle popping and hissing in the fire. Then, as the wood blackened and collapsed, the cry faded into a sob, then silence. The fire danced, sparks flying skyward, and an intense chill swept past us despite the heat. My breath came in shudders, tears slipping down my cheeks. The final chunk of the cradle crumbled, leaving only glowing embers. We stood vigil until the flames died to ashes, hearts pounding. Then the night returned to normal. Crickets, the soft rustle of leaves. We scattered the ashes in the orchard, hoping to transform sorrow into something fertile. The sense of weight lifted from my chest. Even Jacob, who rarely showed emotion, exhaled deeply. Relief etched on his face. That night, no crying woke me, no knocks on the windows. The farmhouse stood tranquil, the summer breeze gentle rather than menacing. In the morning, I stepped onto the porch to find the air sweet with dew. A hummingbird flitted by, sampling the wildflowers I'd planted. I almost collapsed in gratitude. The dark presence that once clung to this place had dissolved, replaced by a quiet kindness. Over time, I found the well pump easier to coax into flow, the orchard thriving under my care. Amish neighbors became occasional visitors. Jacob with fresh eggs, others with handmade quilts. They accepted me as part of their community, or at least an outlier they could respect. I confided in a few about the cradle, about the baby's cries. They listened solemnly, nodding at the mention of curses. Some said the mother never had closure, that her child's spirit wandered. But now, maybe, that spirit had found peace. I returned to my midwife roots in small ways, helping Jacob's sister during her pregnancy, offering gentle advice though I respected Amish traditions. I felt a sense of purpose again, forging a bond with the land that once felt so ominous. On moonlit nights, I'd wander the orchard, remembering how a shrieking wail once echoed through the halls. Now, only the soft hum of cicadas and the sigh of wind. Sometimes I sense a faint presence in the orchard's breeze, a flicker of gratitude or relief, as though the baby's spirit acknowledges my role in releasing it from a sorrowful tether. I've let go of the guilt that I once felt. In destroying the cradle, I believe we freed whatever grief had tormented it. The farmland is no longer heavy with anguish, but open to growth and new life. I still keep a small memorial in the barn, a simple plaque that reads, "For the Lost Child," accompanied by dried flowers. It's my way of honoring the short life that ended in heartbreak. The nights remain calm, the farmhouse a place of gentle chores and quiet reflection rather than haunting cries. Sometimes I hold a friend's newborn, remembering how I once left nursing behind in despair. Now, I see that healing can manifest in many forms. We can heal land, heal memories, even heal the burdens left by those long gone. In the end, I remain here, living off-grid among the Amish farmland, slowly cultivating my own goats, gardens, and a sense of peace. The sorrow that once hovered under my roof departed with the cradle's ashes, scattering across the orchard soil. I like to think it nourishes something kinder now, a symbol of how we can transform suffering into compassion. And if a baby's spirit truly lingered, I hope it finally rests in the gentle hush of these rolling hills, free from the curse that once bound it to an empty cradle in a forgotten barn.